The Iron Hand. The wind was nearly still as the bloodiest day in Westeros for at least a century drew to a close. The chaos and fury of battle had given way to triumph, defeat, and overwhelming exhaustion, both physical and mental, for all who remained. The screams and shouts had faded into moans of pain or suffocating silence, as the stranger's shadow crept across the blood-stained river. Christopher rode wearily atop his mount. The earlier rush of triumph had drained away, replaced by a heavy somberness and gnawing doubts. If someone had asked him directly whether he would sacrifice everything, even Adam, to achieve his ambitions, he knew which choice he would have made. But it was the part of him that sought to justify the loss of his brother that troubled him most. He struggled in that part to find anything he wouldn't sacrifice for his desires, save his own life. It felt crude and callous, but he had been so singularly focused on gaining power that now, having seized it, he found himself almost at a loss for what to do next. So much had been sacrificed, thousands had died, blood had flowed like water, and yet he could only vaguely grasp that he needed to atone, somehow. There was a debt upon his soul now, one he wasn't sure could ever be repaid. Though Christopher was not a religious man, having always said the right words merely to suit his company and the moment, a part of him wondered if the gods, old, new, or something else entirely, had spared him from this battle, this war, this life, for some greater purpose. My lord, Lord Tully and Sir Adam have been separated and prepared for travel, Lord Tytos Blackwood reported from Christopher's flank. A rotating cast of commanders and lords had followed him through the battlefield's aftermath, each with their own agendas, concerns, and demands. It was exhausting, but at least it offered some distraction. Christopher intended to stay busy until sheer fatigue drowned out the thoughts he couldn't bear to dwell on for too long. Trying to pull his mind away from Adam, he quickly shifted the conversation. What are the latest numbers on casualties and prisoners for both sides? Lord Tytos spoke with a solemn tone. The most recent counts put our losses at 9,000 men, while the rebels have lost nearly half their force, 10,000 in total. Lord Crabbe of Cracklaw Point, Lord Footley, Lord Blackbar of the Reach, and Sir Brune of Brown Hollow have all fallen on our side. As you know, Lord Commander Hightower was injured, along with many other lords and knights suffering various degrees of injury. He paused before continuing, his voice growing graver. On the rebel side, it's confirmed that Lord Tully has perished, along with Lord Melcombe and Lord Linderley of the Vale. We've also captured Lord John Arryn, along with Lords Bracken, Piper, Mallister, Redfort, Royce, Belmore, and Corbray. The names caught Christopher's attention, especially John Arryn, but also Royce, Mallister, Bracken, and Corbray. A particular thought flickered in his mind: there was no way he would ever part with Lady Forlorn. Lord Corbray would want the sword back, he would either have to accept Christopher's conquest of it or suffer the consequences. Almost 20,000 casualties, Christopher remarked quietly. Indeed, Tytos Blackwood replied, his voice heavy. Bloodier than the first battle. But hopefully the final one. There was a note of uncertainty in his tone. It is the final one, Christopher declared firmly. Robert Baratheon is still at large, and he leads some men, Blackwood pointed out as they rode back into camp, heading for their tents. Christopher's expression hardened. In the past year, and especially with this battle, we've killed or captured over half of the rebelling lords. Most of the others have bent the knee. Baratheon may be impulsive and willful, but he's no fool. He knows when he's beaten. If he has any sense left, he'll flee to Essos. Hopefully, we'll intercept his ship on the way, but most likely, he'll slip through. He paused, considering the situation. Even if he does escape, it will take years, perhaps decades, before he has any chance to threaten the realm again. By then, we'll be ready. Tytos held Christopher's gaze for a moment, searching for any hint of doubt. Finally, he nodded. I suppose, my lord, he replied, his tone measured. With a respectful inclination of his head, he turned and made his way toward his own tent. Christopher dismounted slowly, handing the reins of his courser to a waiting servant. He had named the horse Stormbreaker, a title he found fitting after the role the steed had played in the defeat of Robert Baratheon. A squire of Lord Randall Tarly helped him out of his armor, the weight of the plate armor finally lifting from his exhausted body. Christopher had yet to take a squire of his own, but he suspected that would soon change. He thanked the young lordling, a boy from one of Tarly's vassal houses, and dismissed him with a nod of acknowledgement. The day had been won. The rebels lay defeated, even if Robert Baratheon still lived. In this moment, only Mace Tyrell with the full strength of the Reach, or a coalition of most of his allies turning against him, could hope to challenge his handship. Otherwise, Christopher stood unchallenged, the most powerful man in the Seven Kingdoms. King's Landing awaited, and with it, the Iron Throne, where he would shape the future of the realm for decades to come. But Christopher was not naive. He knew that this moment, this pinnacle of power, would likely be the greatest he would ever hold. The memories of lords were short, their egos demanding, and by claiming the throne, he had likely signed his own death warrant, destined to face whatever fate his next adversary could devise. His challengers only needed to get lucky once, while Christopher would have to fight and struggle with every new threat. Now, his task was clear: to escape this death warrant with as much of his hard-won gains as possible. There was still work to be done before he could return. He needed to lead the relief of Willow Wood and send forces into the Riverlands to crush any lingering resistance. This would further indebt the Riverland lords to him and lay the groundwork for his future plans. In addition, he had made a decision regarding his bastard son. Elenay had hinted at it when he departed weeks ago. He was to take the boy and raise him, offering him opportunities and resources far beyond what he would have as the fatherless son of an innkeeper. Christopher wanted to persuade Elenay to join them for Tristan's sake, but he remembered her conflicted expression and hesitation when he had broached the subject before leaving. The thought of separating his son from his mother didn't sit well with him, but he was confident he could find a compromise if it came to that. After all, the inn wasn't far from King's Landing, and it lay along the route to the Riverlands. One way or another, Tristan would have the best life Christopher could provide, and he was determined to raise him well, regardless of the challenges. Christopher collapsed heavily onto his cot, the rough bedding that had irritated him throughout the long march from King's Landing now feeling like a luxury against his battered body. The aches of battle and the weight of exhaustion pressed down on him, and the moment his eyes closed, sleep overtook him, deep and dreamless. Lord Mace Tyrell sweated under the relentless sun, grateful that the heat and his bodily discomfort masked his rising nerves. News from the royalist host had been scarce, but a few weeks ago, word finally reached them of the decisive victory, and Robert Baratheon's flight. The news had both elated and frustrated Mace. On the one hand, the royalists had triumphed, but on the other, the irksome Mud Knight had not only survived but fought heroically on the front lines, orchestrating an impressive victory. Robert Baratheon, who had once seemed assured of winning the war, had fled the continent with only a few hundred men. Worst of all, the upstart had managed to acquire a Valyrian steel blade in the process. House Tyrell, to Mace's eternal shame, might not have the strongest claim when it came to lineage and heritage, but at least they had been prominent royal stewards for generations. Christopher Mudd, despite all his talk of ancient royal bloodlines and lofty titles, was little more than a low-born cur who had risen far beyond his station. Mace was further displeased by his absence from the battle, not due to his own choice but by the order of his mother, who had demanded he remain in King's Landing. Obedient as ever, Mace had followed her wishes, filling the court with reachmen loyal to House Tyrell, servants, cooks, and even prominent figures like magisters and harbourmasters. His mother had instructed him to be subtle in this, though her letters were far from subtle themselves, filled with sharp words and more expletives than Mace cared to recall. Still, the parts describing his newborn daughter, Marjorie, softened the sting. On days like this, when the stench of King's Landing became especially unbearable, Mace longed to abandon the wretched city and return to the peace of Highgarden. There, he could enjoy a juicy fruit, sip a fine glass of Arbor Gold, and relax on a balcony overlooking the slow-moving Mander. If not for his mother's insistence, he would have done so already. Instead, He found himself standing in the dusty courtyard of the Red Keep, forced to greet an upstart lowborn who fancied himself hand of the king. It was all deeply humiliating, his sweat, the very situation. It had been Mace's men who had won this war. Without the Reacher's might, Christopher Mudd would be rotting in a ditch, and Robert Baratheon would be sitting on the Iron Throne. Yet, instead of any acknowledgement, the Hedge Knight was showered with raucous celebrations at the head of Mace's army, a full triumph through the city, followed by a grand ceremony in the Red Keep. It was as nauseating as the city's stench. Mace had heeded Lord Tarley's advice when he chose to follow the upstart's plan, confident that if the Hedge Knight succeeded, it would be easy enough to claim his rightful place as leader of the Royalists in time. Mace clenched his teeth as Christopher Mudd, leading a retinue of lords, knights, and hundreds of soldiers, entered the courtyard. The space was filled to capacity with Targaryen household guards, and to Mace's side stood Queen Mother Elia with King Aegon and Princess Rhaenys, flanked by 3 white-cloaked knights of the Kingsguard. Sir Barristan Selmy looked as formidable as ever, despite his greying hair. The Kingsguard knight, who had twice turned his cloak, now stood as prominently as if his loyalty had never been questioned. Mace couldn't help but feel a pang of resentment, not so much for Selmy's past betrayals, but for the fact that the man, a proven traitor, was now given a position more prominent than his own. He was the Lord Paramount of the Reach, and yet a knight who had betrayed 2 kings stood ahead of him. Mace's face burned with indignation, though the blazing sun provided him with a convenient excuse for his flushed cheeks. Mace barely managed to compose himself as Christopher Mudd finished his greetings with the royal family and began moving down the line of courtiers, with Lord Commander Gerald Hightower following closely at his side. The sight of Mace's own uncle-in-law shadowing this lowborn as if he were royalty or legitimate hand only fueled his indignation. Lord Hand, allow me the pleasure of congratulating you on your fantastic victory, Mace said, his words stumbling slightly as the title caught in his throat. I thank you for your kind words, my lord, Mudd replied with a practiced humility. Of course, it will not be forgotten that it was your men and swords who accomplished it. I wager numerous songs will be written of your brave and fierce warriors who were the reason for our victory. Mace forced a loud laugh, though he felt his eye twitch with irritation. Isn't that the truth of it? He replied, his smile strained. Mudd's eyebrow arched slightly as they held each other's gaze, an awkward silence developing. I suppose we will see each other at the council meeting? The Hand eventually said, nodding courteously. Mace never imagined he would receive such lordly courtesy from a dirty lowborn. Mudd might have cloaked himself in gleaming plate armor, with a golden cape draped over his shoulder and his heraldry boldly displayed for all to see. Now, he even carried a Valyrian steel sword at his side, the ruby in its hilt gleaming as the sunlight hit it. Why the gods would grant such an honor to a pest like him was beyond Mace's understanding. It was almost more humiliating than if Lord Lannister had gotten his paws on one. Almost. The entire display, from the armor to the sword, made Mudd look every bit the nobleman. And, infuriatingly, it was convincing. Many lesser men had already been swayed, the spineless fools. Had they no shame? But his mother had advised patience. She had instructed him to wait and assess the situation, writing that a lowborn wildcard like Mudd could present opportunities to exploit or break through the old, suffocating grudges that more storied lords were beholden to. While Mace believed the sooner the upstart was dead or removed, the better, before he did too much damage, his mother saw it differently. Mace was certainly anxious to see how Mudd would handle the aftermath of the war. Perhaps he would be bold enough to claim a lordship for himself? Such a move would be unheard of without leave from the king, but these were unorthodox times, and the lowborn knight certainly didn't lack ambition. Didn't his house have an ancestral seat somewhere in the Riverlands? Mace would also need to adjust his tactics regarding his appointments within the Red Keep. Mudd's cousin had already asked too many questions about his intentions, and Mace had no desire for the Hand's attention to shift toward him. That could be disastrous for his efforts to quietly consolidate power. As soon as Mudd entered the keep, a flock of sycophants trailing behind him, Mace quickly made his escape from the oppressive sun and headed for his chambers. 2 Tyrell guards cleared a path through the sea of nobles, soldiers, and servants as Mace's large form pushed forward. A bit of rest would do him well, he thought, along with a small luncheon. The pork he had feasted on before Mud's arrival was already a distant memory. Christopher had just slid both arms into his new fine black doublet when the door creaked open. In stepped his cousin Robin, his face lined with exhaustion, though he managed a faint smile of greeting. "Robin. I missed you at the welcoming party in the courtyard yesterday," Christopher remarked, moving to greet him. "I'm sorry, matters with the city watch kept me away. The city's been on edge since you left, and now, with the victory confirmed, people are finally starting to relax and celebrate," Robin explained wearily, an apologetic glint in his eyes. Christopher nodded, understanding how matters in the gold cloaks could spring up at the most inopportune moments. He pulled his cousin into a tight embrace. "No harm done. Honestly, you didn't miss much, just a lot of preening lords and fawning minor nobles, especially those of lesser standing seem to believe I will be handing out titles and honors since I am a lowborn." As they separated, Christopher kept his hands resting on Robin's broadening shoulders, giving him a playful once-over. "I see you've filled out since I last saw you. Bit more weight on those bones, or is it muscle?" Robin mimicked his cousin's appraisal, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Speaking of filling out, someone finally took pity on that sorry face of yours and made you a proper doublet, eh? Outgrown the one from Harrenhal?" Christopher grinned at the jab. "Well, they told me showing up in only armor would send the wrong message. Apparently, I'm more than just a lucky hedge knight now." Robin raised an eyebrow. "Really, who told you these lies?" "Let me guess, it comes courtesy of a certain Dornish influence? And I'm not talking about Prince Oberyn." "You'll never know with that tone," Christopher shot back, a grin spreading across his face as Robin's guess hit the mark. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments as Christopher laced up his boots. Then Robin broke the quiet with a casual remark. "There's something I thought you'd want to know." Christopher glanced up at his cousin, intrigued. "Oh?" Robin's expression was curious, his eyes a little more serious than before. "You didn't happen to catch what the small folk were chanting as you rode through the city?" Christopher frowned in thought. The ride through the city had come at the end of a long, unbroken march that had begun in the early morning. He'd been exhausted, mentally preparing for the ceremony at the Red Keep, and the cheers from the crowds had blended together into a distant, muffled roar. "I am afraid I didn't pay much attention to it. No, is there trouble?" Robin looked at him with insignificant expression. No, on the contrary, it seems you've earned yourself an epithet, at least among the small folk. They're calling you the Iron Hand." Christopher raised an eyebrow, momentarily taken aback. He met Robin's gaze, sensing his cousin's curiosity about his reaction. An epithet was unexpected. There was little to control about them, for they sprang from nothing, and if popular by the populace they would stay and color the perception of every man who heard it. The Mad King and Silver Prince were only two of the last examples. But the Iron Hand was nothing to complain about. In fact, it seemed rather fitting. He had been a steadfast hand of the king during the most turbulent times. From a superficial standpoint, at least for now, he appeared to be the perfect savior knight of House Targaryen and the Royalists, a symbol of strength and stability in an uncertain era of the Targaryens. They had been on the edge of oblivion, after all. The Targaryen line of kings had nearly crumbled. Prince Viserys might have survived, safe on Dragonstone as he was, but Christopher doubted whether he could have inspired a movement strong enough to reclaim his father's throne, given the chaos before Christopher's intervention. Ultimately, it didn't matter. He had saved the Targaryens at their lowest point, a position far more precarious than during any of the 5 Blackfyre rebellions. Never had the House of the Dragon come so close to extinction as it had only a year ago. This only meant there was more for Christopher to gain from saving them, though it would take time before the Targaryens themselves regained their former sway. With Aegon grown and crowned as king, Viserys and Rhaenys married off to secure key alliances, the pieces would fall into place. And they would all be in debt to him. Yet, Christopher knew the danger lay not just in external enemies but in the Targaryens themselves. He would do everything in his power to avoid the fractures that had emerged during Aegon V's reign, specifically, the disastrous plans and marriages that had torn apart the stability of the realm. The betrayal of Jaehaerys II and the rejection of his father's marriage proposals had likely sown the first seeds of discord that Aerys later let grow into madness. No, that could not happen again. What do you think of it? Robin's voice snapped Christopher back to the present. For a moment, Christopher stayed silent, gathering his thoughts. Then, remembering what they had been discussing, he replied, I suppose it's a fine name. Flattering, certainly. It may help sway public opinion, at least with the small folk. They enjoy a good story, and an epithet gives them one. Robin nodded, a glint of mischief in his eyes. I don't think it'll stay among the small folk for long. It's a solid epithet, and it might be worth encouraging it to spread. My associates in more noble circles could help with that. Word has a way of traveling when it starts in the brothels. You've already thought this through, I see. Very well, let it spread. Christopher was reminded of how useful Robin's web of connections truly was, worth every silver stag spent. But he also remembered what he'd been preparing for before Robin had interrupted his thoughts. Would you accompany me to the council chambers? And will you be joining us today? Robin nodded, though his gaze seemed to shift, as if something else had caught his attention. I've delegated the most pressing matters to Captain Lucas. I'll handle the rest after the meeting, he replied. Then, with a glance past Christopher, he added, but I couldn't help but notice the sword leaning against the wall behind you. I don't believe I've seen it before. Christopher turned briefly to where Lady Forlorn rested against the wall beside his looking-glass, the prominent red heart-shaped ruby on the hilt catching the light. It was a stunning sword, its Valyrian steel blade a mark of true craftsmanship. Still, he thought there were improvements to be made, touches that would make it a perfect fit for its new owner and a fitting ancestral weapon for House Mud. Is it truly Valyrian steel, as they say? Robin asked from behind him, a hint of reverence in his voice. He glanced over his shoulder as he walked toward the sword. Who says? Christopher took hold of the sword by its sheath as Robin answered. There have been countless rumors since word of your victory over the rebels spread. The tale of you winning a Valyrian steel blade in personal combat has become quite popular. But many were uncertain about which sword it would be. Considering that Sir Lyn Corbray lost his life in battle, would it be safe to say that you're holding Lady Forlorn? He grasped the hilt, and with a hiss of steel, the dark ripples of the legendary Valyrian blade emerged, shimmering in the light. Robin stepped closer, eyes wide with admiration as he took in the flawless craftsmanship. It's beautiful. Christopher nodded, carefully sheathing the blade and strapping it onto his sword belt. It truly is, but I'm afraid we have a council to attend. Of course, Robin replied after a moment, still looking at the sword on his hip. They stepped out of Christopher's quarters and made their way toward the stairs leading down the Tower of the Hand. They walked conversing about small matters, descending the tower and crossing the courtyard before entering the keep proper. Christopher noticed Robin's tension and somber demeanor as they walked. When he finally commented on it, Robin hesitated before speaking. Where did you lay Adam? Christopher's heart clenched at the reminder. In Sow's Horn, across the river from the mill, he began quietly. A small ceremony, just a few nobles and some of the gold-cloaked lieutenants who served under him. His mind drifted back to the somber affair, remembering the moment when Adam's body was lowered beneath the great oak tree that overlooked the river and mill. We received Sir Roger's hospitality afterward at the keep, Christopher continued, his voice heavy with the weight of memory. I told him of Adam's fate, and he hailed him as his son during the feast. Vowed to honor the grave. He sighed, feeling the tension in the air as Robin's expression darkened with simmering anger. I can't say how sincere Sir Roger was, but he recognized Adam's death as a true knight's end. That, at least, is something Sir Roger seems to hold in high regard. For all the good that does now, Robin replied quietly. Indeed. But I believe Adam would have appreciated it. We were always his true family regardless.
I should have been there, Robin said haltingly, his voice thick with regret and pain.
Christopher turned to him, his expression softening. There's no blame to place on yourself, Robin. You were where you needed to be, and Adam would understand that. We'll visit his grave soon, and you can pay your respects then. You know Adam would never hold it against you. He did not wish for his cousin to blame himself for something like that. If any were to blame for Robin's absence, it was his after all, as it was his orders that had kept his cousin in King's Landing. Robin remained silent, his gaze distant, but Christopher trusted that his words would reach his cousin in time. Adam had been family to both of them, and they each carried the loss in their own way. Any further discussion was cut short as they reached the heavy oaken doors of the council chambers. Sir Gerald and Sir Valtries nodded in greeting before admitting them entrance. Christopher and Robin exchanged a final look before stepping inside. This was where the fate of the Seven Kingdoms would be shaped, where House Mud would begin its return from the brink of extinction. Christopher hoped his grandfather was watching from beyond, proud of what he had accomplished and that his dream was finally within reach. Will we pursue him further? Robin asked as they walked through the crimson corridors of the Red Keep. Today was no ordinary day, and if there was one thing Christopher couldn't afford to be late for, it was this. No, Christopher replied, his tone measured. Braavos would never tolerate the apprehension of a man simply for being a claimant for throne. It would set a dangerous precedent, and the Iron Bank values its reputation for providing safe asylum. If we were caught trying to abduct him, we'd risk a full-blown diplomatic crisis with Braavos. After 3 years of war, our treasury isn't nearly strong enough to weather such a storm. Testing the patience of Braavos, or worse, the Iron Bank, would be reckless. Robin listened intently, nodding as they continued down the hallway. He's safe for now, Christopher continued, but consider this, either he dies in Essos, and the problem solves itself, or he eventually tries to return. If he does, we'll be ready. By then, his potential allies will be weakened, and the Targaryens will have grown stronger. Robin stayed silent as Christopher's thoughts drifted to Robert Baratheon, the man who had once again eluded them. Christopher couldn't help but brood over the missed opportunity. If he had pursued Robert during his retreat from the Trident, he might have had a better chance at capturing him. Perhaps he had made the wrong choice. Away from the chaos of battle, in the cold light of reason, he could admit that prioritizing his fallen brother Adam over capturing a man who could yet rally another rebellion was likely a mistake. But it was the choice he had made. He would never apologize for it. Honoring his chosen brother's memory was never going to be something he would apologize for, even if it led to a future punishment for himself. It certainly did not matter any longer, for the decision had been made and Robert would live still. After fleeing the disastrous defeat at the Trident with a few hundred loyal men, Robert had vanished. The rebels had boarded ships at Saltpans, vessels whose owners even Varys couldn't trace, and sailed east across the narrow sea. The Royal Navy, under Sir Montford Velaryon, had intercepted 5 ships leaving the Bay of Crabs, all heading toward Pentos. Those ships had been filled with rebels, men who had fled the Trident with Baratheon, but none carried Robert himself. The mystery of his whereabouts had gnawed at the court until, after extensive questioning of the captured rebels, they relented. Robert and a small retinue had taken a different route, departing from Gulltown and slipping past the reports of rebels fleeing Saltpans. While Velaryon and others pursued what they believed were the escort of Baratheon, Robert had gone north, escaping to Braavos, well out of their grasp. Though in this deception a majority of the retreating rebels that had been with Robert had been sacrificed and captured to allow for this to happen. It won't be the last we see of him, I'm afraid, Christopher said, his voice tinged with frustration. Robin nodded in agreement. No, we won't be that lucky. But now you have the chance to make his return as difficult as possible. The peace deal will certainly leave many rebels nursing deep wounds. That was true, Christopher reflected as they approached the throne room. Today, for the first time, he would sit upon the Iron Throne as Hand of the King, in front of a full court, to lay out the punishments and reveal the consequences of the rebellion. The decisions had already been painstakingly debated during the council meeting 3 days ago, timed to allow more lords to gather in King's Landing. A few notable absences stood out, most significantly the Wents, who had been delayed due to undisclosed matters at Harrenhal. The letters sent to King's Landing had been frustratingly vague, leaving Christopher to wonder what was happening with the representatives from every Lord Paramount, and most major houses were in attendance, either as captives or guests. The great families of Westeros had all gathered, their fates hanging in the balance of today's judgments. The Starks had Lord Eddard, while the Lannisters were represented by Lord Tywin and Sir Jaime of course. From Dorne was Prince Oberyn. The Tyrells had Lord Mace, and the Tullys, still reeling from the recent loss of Lord Hoster and Sir Brynden in the rebellion, were represented by his 3 surviving children, brought safely to the capital by Lord Tytos Blackwood under Christopher's command. House Baratheon was represented by young Renly, the only living Baratheon brother on the continent. Finally, the last of the great lords was Lord Jon Arryn, the foster father of 2 of the rebels' most prominent figures. As they arrived at the side entrance to the throne room, Christopher could feel the anticipation build within him. His cousin's voice broke his thoughts. "For House Mudd, right?" Robin murmured, steady and reassuring at his side. Christopher turned, meeting Robin's gaze. For House Mudd, of course. Every step he'd taken had been for his house, even when there were very few left to bear the name. He could only hope that somewhere, his grandsire was watching, bearing witness to the realization of his lifelong dream. Taking a deep breath, he nodded toward the door, where the murmurs of an expectant crowd drifted through the heavy wood. Robin held his gaze a moment longer, his eyes steady and full of encouragement, before stepping forward to knock firmly. The great doors opened slowly, guards in finery opening them, creaking as light spilled into the entrance and onto Christopher. Robin moved back to his side, and together they stepped into the throne room, now gone silent, all eyes fixed on them. The hall was packed. Hundreds of lords and ladies filled the vast space, their gazes a mixture of apprehension, awe, and wariness. Only moons ago, most of these nobles would have looked down upon him, dismissing him as a low-born upstart. Others, even weeks ago, had clung to their status and positions, blind to how swiftly tides could turn. That was before the Second Battle of the Trident. The first battle had solidified Robert Baratheon as the Demon of the Trident. The second had made Christopher the Iron Hand, the name spoke of his firmness and spine as Hand of the King. Foreign concepts in his immediate predecessors. Now the nobles looked at him with anticipation, awe, and fear in equal measures. And these were all either royalists or neutrals in the war, well technically. Many were vassals of rebelling Lord Paramounts, so some had most certainly supported the rebels in some capacity, but it had been decided by the small council after some debate to focus upon the Lord Paramounts and most prominent commanders. Vassals were, after all, bound to follow their lieges, even if those lieges led them into rebellion. Such loyalty, however misguided, was how the system worked. Lord Christopher Mudd, hand to King Aegon VI of his name. The herald's voice echoed, though his identity was already well known. By now, Christopher was likely the most famous man in the city, and though his reputation did not yet rival that of Tywin Lannister, his name had surely reached every household in the Crownlands. The silence that followed seemed almost reverent as he approached the Iron Throne, his footsteps measured. He could feel the weight of the moment settle heavily, but he welcomed it. Today was about more than punishment, it was about stability and renewal. Flanking the Iron Throne stood several key figures. To one side, Lord Mace Tyrell, his mouth set in a thin line, looked faintly disgruntled despite his attempt at hiding it. Beside him, Varys, draped in silk and inscrutable as ever, watched Christopher with eyes as unreadable as his placid face. Lord Lucerys Velaryon, however, was the picture of open anticipation. Opposite them was Princess Elia, with her expression composed but thoughtful, as she held the young Princess Rhaenys close. At her side, the Lord Commander Gerald Hightower stood like a marble sentinel. Completing the tableau, the recently arrived Queen Rhaella sat on a wooden chair near the throne, her expression an impassive mask, though Christopher could read in her eyes the cold scrutiny she leveled at him. Rhaella had been summoned from Dragonstone with her children, the young Prince Viserys, now 7, and the newly born Princess Daenerys. Though polite, she clearly held reservations about him, a man she saw as an ambitious outsider, thrust swiftly to power. Christopher understood her apprehension. His rapid ascent had unsettled many, and Rhaella seemed to view him with particular suspicion. Still, he had saved her house from ruin, and if she would not recognize that debt, then he would ensure that her disapproval would not impede him. An exile on Dragonstone might be inevitable if she proved uncooperative. The ancestral island would hopefully keep her content and mitigate her influence. He would not be lucky enough to separate her children from her hands, but that was something to handle at another time. Christopher's gaze lingered on the Iron Throne, a mass of twisted metal, melted and reforged into a towering reminder of the Conqueror's legacy. Beneath the flickering torchlight, he could make out the forms of old blades and hilts jutting from its surface, though many had melted into jagged, unrecognizable shapes. The steps leading up to the seat were uneven, yet even with these imperfections, Christopher could not help but regard it with awe and reverence. Most regarded the Seven Kingdoms as the Conqueror's crowning achievement, a testament to his might and Balerion's wrath. Yet Christopher would argue otherwise. The Iron Throne itself, that jagged seat of power, might have been an even greater creation. For it was the very symbol of the realm, and when one thought of the king, they envisioned him upon this throne, regardless of who wore the crown. He climbed the crooked steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the tense silence as hundreds of eyes followed his every movement. Reaching the topmost step, he turned and settled into the throne. The iron was bitterly cold, and the multitude of blades woven around him, dulled though they were by years, pressed uncomfortably into his back. A part of him could not shake the fear that one might still hold a hidden edge, one that could slice his flesh. Every child of the Crownlands had heard of the fate of Maegor the Cruel, after all. He dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it had come. 14 Targaryen kings had ruled from the Iron Throne since Maegor's day, and none had met the same fate. Whether Maegor's death was a stroke of poetic justice or the work of unseen hands, it was likely nothing more than cautionary folklore now, no more dangerous than nicking oneself on the throne's jagged edges. Christopher lifted his gaze to the assembled crowd, their silence thick and heavy, a tapestry woven of envy, judgment, and, in some, a glimmer of awe. The Iron Throne was more than a mere seat of iron, it was a force of its own, an amplifier of majesty and menace. If even Mad King Aerys could seem imposing upon it, then surely it held a power beyond the metal. From this height, Christopher could understand how the Targaryen kings, and their hands, might have been consumed by pride. Below him, the greatest lords of the realm looked lesser, reduced to figures of inconsequence. Men and women who ruled vast lands and commanded armies now seemed small, insignificant, even weak. He barely suppressed a shake of his head at the foolish thoughts. Why did he think himself better with such thoughts finding purchase in his mind? No, he was better than them. He was not one to dismiss those that could facilitate his downfall tomorrow. He had power now, but it was far from limitless. Right now it only seemed more significant compared to the other lords' current weakness. A full minute passed as Christopher forced his pride and ambition into check, chiding himself for entertaining such reckless impulses. Rising from the throne, he allowed himself a moment to admire the glint of the newly set emerald in his sword's hilt, catching the light streaming through the colored windows behind him. Yesterday, he had commissioned one of the finest smiths on the Street of Steel to craft a new handle for Lady Forlorn, something more fitting for a mudlord. The sword now bore a pommel adorned with a striking green emerald, encircled by a crown of small bronze spikes in homage to the ancient sigil of House Mud. The smith had told him that the emerald was likely from distant Essos, perhaps even from the legendary mines of Yi Ti in the Far East. Christopher appreciated the rarity of the stone and was pleased with the favorable price, a gesture of gratitude from the smith for his recent defense of the city. Accepting the gift without question, he had rewarded the craftsman generously, adding a few gold dragons atop the agreed sum and promising to return if he required further work. The blade would need a new name. Lady Forlorn belonged to House Corbray, This sword was now a possession of House Mudd, and it deserved a title that reflected its new lineage. Perhaps something tied to his own epithet? Christopher turned the idea over in his mind, considering the immediate ideas he got. He would have to give it some thought. It was only fitting for such a weapon. Ladies, lords, sirs, and all others present, Lord Christopher Mudd proclaimed, his voice carrying through the vast hall. I, Lord Christopher Mudd, Hand of King Aegon, sixth of his name, hereby call for Lord Tywin Lannister to stand before us and hear the judgment rendered for the crimes he stands accused of. At his summons, the guards at the great doors swung them open, revealing Lord Tywin Lannister escorted by 2 gold cloaks and flanked on each side by Targaryen guards. The proud lord strode forward without chains, yet there was a weariness about him, carefully concealed but unmistakable. His attire, though fine, was notably humbler than usual, with only a modest lion embroidered on his breast, a shadow of the grandeur he typically displayed. Lord Mace had provided the attire, and even if Lord Lannister never even paid the Tyrell a glance, Christopher thought he could feel the animosity as Lord Tywin was stood below the dais holding the small council and royals. Lord Tywin Lannister, the herald intoned, his voice resonating throughout the throne room, you stand charged with high treason and rebellion against your rightful king. Do you deny any of these charges? A tense silence enveloped the crowd as Tywin's pale green eyes flicked from the herald to Christopher. I do not, he replied, his voice steady. A murmur of whispers erupted among the audience, but no one dared interrupt the proceedings, not even the Lannister vassals. Whether out of fear or an understanding that the decisions had already been debated and agreed upon, they held their tongues. The only unknown for Tywin was the extent of his punishment. He had been assured that he and his family would survive. Christopher met Lord Tywin's gaze without flinching, feeling a small victory when the older lord finally turned his attention back to the herald. Your honesty and cooperation will not go unrecognized, the herald continued, his voice steady. Therefore, let it be known what the consequences of this rebellion shall be. The throne room held its breath in anticipation as he began to read the decree. Firstly, House Lannister will be required to pay reparations for damages incurred during their march to and siege of King's Landing. These will be remitted to the Crown within 5 years. Furthermore, House Lannister's taxes to the King will be increased by half for the next 10 years, after which they will be reduced by a quarter over the subsequent 5 years until they return to previous levels. The reactions to this announcement were muted. While the penalties were substantial, they lacked the dramatic weight that might have stirred the crowd. Even Lord Tywin seemed unfazed, his expression betraying little concern as he listened. Christopher wondered if he would feel the same indifference as the next points were revealed. Point 2, the herald announced, the heirs of House Westerling, Lyddon, and Lefford, Reynold Westerling, Alysanne Lefford, and Yonos Lyddon, are to become hostages to the crown indefinitely, until such time as decided by either the king or his regent. This pronouncement sent a ripple of shock through the hall. Lord Tywin's eyes narrowed, his gaze locking onto Christopher's, and a flicker of anger momentarily disturbed his composed expression. The Westerland lords and ladies gasped and muttered in dismay, though the sharp glances and readied spears of the gold cloaks swiftly quelled any open protest. Those unfamiliar with the geography and politics of the Westerlands seemed puzzled by the choice of these particular houses, perhaps assuming them chosen at random. Yet Christopher, and, most significantly, Tywin, understood the true weight of this decision. The Crag, the Golden Tooth, and Deep Den guarded 3 of the 4 key routes into the heart of the Westerlands, Lannisport, the Rock, and the rich mines that formed the backbone of Lannister wealth. Defense would be greatly diminished with access to only one. Having access to 3 would make Lord Tywin very hesitant for armed conflict. The final route was defended by Craighall, but it was possible to circumvent and therefore not as critical. The herald continued, his voice rising over the scattered murmurs. For the third point, Lady Cersei Lannister, daughter of Lord Tywin, will be wed to her cousin, Sir Reginald Lannister, within the year. Confusion rippled through the crowd at this seemingly trivial command, but Christopher knew that this was no minor detail. The match was, in fact, a carefully aimed strike. Lady Cersei's beauty and Lannister name had made her a prime asset in securing a powerful alliance for her father. Yet a marriage to Sir Reginald, who only was a Lannister of Lannisport, ever loyal to their kin regardless, was a waste politically, a move that prevented Tywin from expanding his network of allies either within the realm or beyond it. The herald's voice rang with finality. And finally, Sir Jaime Lannister, guilty of kingslaying and breaking his vows to the Kingsguard, will either face death or serve the wall bereft of his manhood and sword hand. Gods curse his name, the herald finished in a quieter voice, still the silence let it sweep across the room. Christopher met Tywin's furious gaze head-on. The legendary composure of Lord Lannister had shattered, replaced by a barely concealed fury. Gone was the mask of indifference Tywin so often wore, stripped away by the weight of these judgments. On the surface, each punishment might seem minor, but together, they formed a masterful punishment that wounded Tywin's power without a single execution, an outcome that suited Christopher well, for he lacked the political capital to demand blood and still hoped to achieve his ambitions in the Riverlands. The judgment struck at Tywin from every angle. Financially, the increased taxes and reparations would be a burden on the Lannister coffers. Militarily, the hostages essentially held open the gates of the Westerlands to any royal army, leaving his defences compromised. Politically, the forced marriage of Lady Cersei destroyed any hopes of an influential alliance, and finally, personally, the loss of his golden heir wounded Tywin's pride and legacy. This last punishment, though likely the least surprising, was among the harshest, a public blow to Tywin's ambitions for House Lannister's future. "The will of the king has been spoken," Christopher declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Should Lord Lannister fail in any of these demands, his life and title shall be forfeit in the eyes of the crown. Take him away." Christopher held Tywin's gaze steadily, unwavering in the face of the older lord's simmering fury. The room remained silent, every noble watching as two of Christopher's gold cloaks stepped forward, each gripping Tywin firmly by the shoulder and turning him to face the long walk back to the main entrance. Forced to walk past every noble gathered, Tywin was denied the dignity of even a hasty exit. His usually proud and commanding presence was shadowed by the weight of this humiliation. As the doors closed with a resounding bang, Christopher noticed he had half risen from the Iron Throne in the heat of the moment. Steeling himself, he slowly lowered back onto the jagged seat, nodding to the herald below. "Bring in the next." Glancing to his left, he caught the eyes of Princess Elia and Queen Rhaella. Elia's expression held a quiet awe, a spark of admiration that hinted at newfound respect. Rhaella, however, seemed deeply unsettled, her face drawn in a look of pensive concern. She watched him with the wary eyes of someone who had lived through the consequences of unchecked power and ruthless ambition. Perhaps she feared she saw the seeds of a new Tywin Lannister in him, a prospect she was likely far from eager to embrace. Before he could consider it further, the great doors opened once more. This time, a young boy stood framed in their shadows, his slight form dwarfed by the towering Targaryen guards on either side. Renly Baratheon, brother to the traitors Stannis and Robert Baratheon, the herald proclaimed. Renly's face was pale, eyes wide with barely concealed fear. A gentle nudge from one of his escorts prompted him forward, his steps hesitant as he approached the throne. The silence in the hall turned awkward, a different tension filling the room as nobles shifted in their seats, their unease more apparent. Christopher leaned back slightly, regarding the trembling boy with a measured gaze. Renly had little to fear here today, his fate was already decided, as long as he didn't do anything foolish. For now, Renly had a role to play, a pawn in the larger game, and Christopher had every intention of keeping him alive to serve that purpose. Yet, watching the young Baratheon, small and visibly shaken, he felt a twinge of discomfort. The boy's fear was painfully evident, this would indeed be a long day indeed. Elia Martell felt the exhaustion approach as the proceedings stretched into the afternoon. The golden light spilling through the throne room's tall windows had grown warmer, deepening into the rich hues of late day. Hours had passed since they'd broken their fast, and though many others had come and gone, Elia remained steadfast, her gaze trained on the Iron Throne. Her daughter Rhaenys, having dozed off some time ago, had been quietly taken to rest in her chambers. But Elia would not allow herself the same relief. She was determined to witness this day's events in full, if only for the satisfaction of seeing justice served to those who had attempted to bring devastation and ill ends to her family. Seeing Lord Tywin forced to face his punishment made the long day feel worth it. The lion's pride had taken a blow, both literally and figuratively. But Tywin was not a man to endure humiliation quietly, and the thought of what he might attempt in revenge left her uneasy. His silent fury as he was led away sent a chill through her, a reminder of just how dangerous a wounded lion could be. She understood why he couldn't simply be executed. The matter had been debated extensively in the preceding small council meetings. Christopher had defended the decision despite strong objections from both Lord Mace and Lord Lucerys, who had argued for a harsher penalty. After the lion came young Renly. Though he appeared nervous, and many had assumed he'd face harsh consequences for his brother's rebellion, he had ultimately been named the new Lord of Storm's End and Lord Paramount of the Stormlands. However, he was required to remain a ward of the crown until his 16th name day. The Stormlands themselves did not escape unscathed. As punishment for their defiance, several of the Baratheons' most powerful northern vassals, House Errol, the breadbasket of the Stormlands, along with prominent houses like Catherine, Fell, and Buckler, were transferred directly under the Crown's authority. No longer Baratheon vassals, these lands were effectively absorbed into the Crownlands, shrinking Storm's End's influence and creating a vulnerability just beyond one of the Stormlands' strongest natural defenses, the Kingswood, which had historically shielded them from northern invasions. To further weaken any future resistance, House Martell and Dorne were given hostages from every Marcher house, stripping the Stormlands of yet another layer of protection. With these measures in place, even if an adult were to eventually rule the Stormlands, any dreams of revenge would be effectively stifled for decades. It was a calculated, ruthless punishment that curbed the Baratheons' power without completely destabilizing the region, a carefully measured approach that explained why House Baratheon, though diminished, was still allowed to remain as Lords Paramount. Replacing Lords Paramount was risky, it set a dangerous precedent, and even attempting it carried significant risks. After Renly Baratheon came Jon Arryn, who was treated with greater leniency. He was required to pay reparations to his vassal House Grafton and to foster any future heir he might have with his current wife, Lysa Tully, under Christopher's guardianship. Additionally, he was forced to swear that any of his children would hold no claim to the Riverlands or Riverrun. The elderly lord seemed to recognize the mercy in these terms and accepted them without protest. Next came Lord Eddard Stark. Acknowledging that his reasons for rebellion were justifiable, the council spared him severe punishment. He was only required to renounce any future claim his children with Lady Catelyn Tully might have to Riverrun, and to send his brother, Benjen, as a ward and hostage to Christopher. Still, the nobles in attendance began murmuring amongst themselves. This was a rebellion, after all, and not a single lord had yet been sentenced to death for treason. A few were surely wondering if Christopher was being too lenient. But Elia knew their doubts would soon be dispelled, for the Hand had saved his greatest demand for last. And after this final edict, many would understand why Christopher had been saving his political capital. If they would agree with it was another question. As Lord Eddard's cloaked figure disappeared from the throne room, escorted by gold cloaks, 3 smaller figures replaced him. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the crowd as the remaining children of the late Lord Hoster Tully were led forward and brought to their knees before the Iron Throne and Christopher. The youngest, Lord Edmure, looked frightened, his blue eyes wide and flickering beneath his auburn fringe, much like young Renly had been. Lady Lysa, Lord Arryn's young bride, appeared both confused and fearful. It was clear she did not share her sister's composure or resolve. The eldest, Lady Catelyn, was a striking young woman whose expression balanced between the careful courtesy drilled into her by her scepter and a defiant spark, hinting at her resentment toward the man responsible for their family's downfall. The herald's voice rang out over the hushed crowd. Lord Edmure Tully, Lady Catelyn Stark, and Lady Lysa Arryn are summoned before the court in place of their late father, Lord Hoster Tully. A pause settled over the hall as the herald continued. It has been judged that the late Lord Tully's actions were the least justified of all who rose in rebellion, motivated by ambition over honour, and a flagrant breach of his oaths and obligations. Therefore, House Tully is found guilty of high treason and rebellion. As punishment, House Tully is hereby stripped of the Lord Paramountcy of the Riverlands and of the Lordship of River Run. The herald's gaze swept over the kneeling siblings, each reacting differently to the harsh decree. Edmure's face was ashen with fear, Lysa's lips quivered in confusion and dismay, and Caitlyn's blue eyes shimmered with tears, not of fear, but of fierce, defiant anger. Compared to her siblings, she alone held her head high, her emotions tempered by pride and resentment. In the presence of this court and the gods, the herald intoned, his voice echoing through the hall, each remaining member of House Tully shall now and forever relinquish all claims they hold, or believe themselves to hold, over River Run and the Riverlands. The demand was met with profound silence, the crowd watching in a tense, almost reverent hush. Lysa and Edmure, frozen with fear and confusion, both glanced uncertainly at their eldest sister.
I, Lady Caitlyn.
Stark, she began, her voice wavering as she grappled with the words. She faltered, and Elia noticed Christopher's eyebrow rise in silent expectation. Caitlyn swallowed, steadying herself. Do now and forever relinquish any claim for myself or my children to the Riverlands or River Run. Her voice echoed across the throne room, hanging in the heavy air. Christopher nodded with a neutral expression before turning his gaze to Lady Lysa. The young woman looked petrified, her face pale as she glanced nervously at her sister. With Caitlyn's quiet urging, Lysa finally mustered the strength to repeat the renunciation, though her voice trembled with each word. Young Edmure, barely 10 years of age, could hardly speak above a whisper, but after further encouragement from Caitlyn, he managed to murmur his own reluctant surrender. As the boy's words faded, it felt as though the entire court collectively exhaled, whether from relief or disappointment was difficult to determine. Some nobles were indifferent to the fate of their rivals, regardless of age. A rival's downfall, no matter how it came about, was of little concern to them. As the herald prepared to speak, he was interrupted by Christopher himself, rising from the throne. He cut an impressive figure, a glinting emerald at his hip showcasing his new Valyrian steel blade. Dressed in a sleek black doublet and trousers, he embodied the role of Hand of the King. Elia felt a surge of relief knowing that he had forged a connection with Aegon. It would be crucial to have a strong hand to protect her son as he grew. I shall take young Edmure as my squire, Christopher announced, casting a significant look at the boy. The sins of the father shall not fall upon the son. May he serve me well, and perhaps in this duty, House Tully may regain its honor. The wordplay of House Tully's words were not lost on most. He continued, his voice steady and commanding, I will assume the responsibilities of Lord of River Run and Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, stewarding these lands in the name of King Aegon. My house once reigned as kings from our ancestral seat of Oldstones. House Mud shall restore the Riverlands to the Targaryen fold and ensure that such treachery never rises again from those lands. Elia had overheard quiet discussions and hushed debates about who would become the new Lord Paramount, and this revelation left the entire room in stunned silence. Court is adjourned, Christopher declared as he descended from the throne. Sir Gerald, Robin, and a contingent of gold cloaks formed a protective circle around him as he left the room, seemingly indifferent to the chaos he had created. Suddenly, Elia felt a sharp tap on her shoulder. As she turned to address the person behind her, she froze at the sight of Rhaella, whose expression was filled with concern and barely contained panic. Elia had never seen her good mother so animated. Rhaella had always been reserved, concealing her emotions behind a mask of courtesy during the years of Aerys' reign. The intensity of her reaction left Elia unsure of how to respond. He's just a new Tywin all over again, Rhaella declared, her voice rising with urgency. Can't you see how he's exploiting his dominant position? We must replace him by any means necessary. Elia took a step back, shocked. Replace Christopher? After all he had done for them and for her son? She could never betray him in such a way. What are you talking about? Calm yourself, she insisted, unwilling to entertain such talk about Christopher. Ryella's expression grew cold as she stepped back, her dark eyes glinting with intensity. The purple hue in her irises seemed to deepen, almost shifting to black in her fury. "You've been manipulated, and you're too blind to see it," Rayella said, her eyebrows narrowing into a severe expression as if she had reached a conclusion. "You're letting your feelings cloud your judgment. Do you really think he has feelings for you? Would he feel the same if you were just a simple lowborn?" Elia bristled at the accusation. "How dare you? I will not listen to these lies. He saved us, saved me. When the mountain tried to kill my children and me, he fought him single-handedly. I owe him everything. You wouldn't be here if not for him," she pressed. "That may be true," the former queen conceded, "but can't you see the threat he poses? For your son, Aegon, if he wished him harm, who could stop him?" She interrupted Elia's rebuttal with a pointed gaze. "Yes, he has accomplished his tasks, but he is not of our house. He holds no loyalty to the dragon as we do. Who knows what he truly seeks? A weak and pliable hand is better than a powerful and ambitious one, surely you must see that. Christopher will bring peace, poor child, blinded by what? Lust? Attraction? Love?" Rayella scoffed, her breath coming a little heavier as her frustration mounted. Elia blinked, stunned by how quickly their conversation had devolved. Looking around, she noticed that most of the occupants were leaving the throne room. A few had paused, their curious glances revealing that they were eavesdropping. The nobles would surely revel in the spectacle of two queen mothers at odds. Shaking her head fiercely, she declared, "I will not hear more of this treason." With that, she spun on her heel, her conservative black and red dress, one she had favored since Aegon's birth, sweeping across the stone floor. The thought that people like Rayella were already plotting to replace Christopher filled her with anger and resolve. She would have to tell him. She could understand the argument that they didn't know all his ambitions and motivations, but surely, after all he had done for them, saving their lives and preserving their throne, they owed him the benefit of the doubt. Why couldn't Rayella see that? Lord of the Trident. Lady Olenna Tyrell sighed as she looked down into the small crib, her sharp gaze softening at the sight of her first granddaughter, now 7 moons old. Little Marjorie, sweet and slumbering, had the Tyrell name and blood, a blessing Olenna thanked the gods for every day. If her son's wife Allery had produced yet another boy, Olenna might have seriously considered throttling someone. Heirs were a necessity, yes, but they could also be an exasperation. 2 was sensible, even strategic, 4, however, was simply inviting trouble. Willis, to her relief, had proven a thoughtful exception, Garland slightly less so, and Loras had only confirmed her suspicions about the limitations of boys. Any attempt to shape them, to steer them from reckless tendencies, seemed fruitless. Her words drifted in one ear and promptly out the other. She loved her grandsons, of course, but affection aside, Olenna Tyrell was more than just a doting grandmother. With her son Mace bungling his way through leadership, it was Olenna who bore the weight of House Tyrell on her shoulders. And at 56, with her back aching more often than not, she could feel the press of time. The need for a true heir, someone with both wit and will, had never felt more urgent. Girls, she knew from experience, could be molded. While the boys lunged headfirst into any situation, thinking with their swords regardless of situation more often than not, a girl could be guided, made malleable and receptive. Her daughters, Janna and Mina, had proven this, though it had taken patience to bring out the potential within each of them. If Olenna hadn't endured the pains of childbirth herself, she might have doubted that Mace was kin to his sisters at all, so vastly different were their minds. Little Marjorie was already promised to be a queen. When Olenna first heard of the marriage offer her son received from this lowborn hand, it stirred up memories of her own long-ago betrothal to Prince Daeron, a Targaryen match once meant for her. But Daeron, she soon discovered, had little interest in her, favoring swords over sheaths, as they said, and Olenna had quickly realized that a marriage to him would have left her disappointed, cold, and sidelined. Besides, Daeron's position had scarcely been worth the trouble. He was the third son of the king, the spare to the spare. True, Aegon V had been the fourth son of a fourth son, but Olenna harbored no illusions that such fortune would strike thrice. History, with its unforgiving hindsight, showed that this had been no poor decision for her. The throne passed to Jaehaerys, the second son, while the third son quietly faded into obscurity. So, she'd set her sights on Luther Tyrell, whose affections had never wavered in private chambers. Still, the gods had perhaps taken their revenge in the form of Mace, who turned out to be as much of an oaf as his father, if not more. Still, her son was not entirely without use. Olenna had directed Mace to secure a foundation of power in King's Landing, smaller posts and positions that would provide both leverage and insurance for House Tyrell. But she wasn't so narrow-minded as to be instantly hostile to this new player. Christopher Mudd was a mystery. Her agents and sources had turned up little on his background. Rumors, however, were overwhelming. The small folk had conjured up all manner of stories. Some claimed he was the illegitimate son of Aerys, others whispered of Lord Perkin Hayford or Sir Roger Hogg, and some even tied him to the late Steffon Baratheon for reasons no one could quite explain. It seemed the fact that Mudd opposed the Baratheons was enough to stir the imaginations of the people. But Olenna, ever the pragmatist, was not one for idle gossip. What mattered were the facts. And when she looked beyond the rumors, she concluded that Mudd's opposition to the Baratheons was incidental. It was his strategic gamble that intrigued her. He had staked everything on the weaker side of a fractured and disorganized conflict, a side that simply needed a strong hand to guide them. Olenna couldn't help but admire the boldness of it. Mudd's success had been helped along, of course, by Mace's bumbling and the erratic instability of King Aerys, but still, to maneuver the largest army in the Seven Kingdoms through 3 consecutive victories against some of the realm's best was no small feat. Now, in the aftermath, he commanded more respect and influence than most lords despite only holding the loyalty of a few thousand gold-cloaked guardsmen. It was a masterstroke, and Olenna knew better than to ignore such skill. If he was this capable with so little, perhaps he might prove useful. Not to mention his initial claim to fame during the tourney of Harrenhal. His performance in the melee had been overshadowed, of course, by yet another unstable Targaryen, but it was there that Christopher had first proven he was more than just another lucky hedge knight. He had shown skill, determination, and an ability to stand out even in the shadow of greater men. Olenna had yet to uncover the full story of how he and his companions had ended up in the Gold Cloaks. What intrigued Olenna most was Mudd's departure from the tourney of Harrenhal. He had left in the company of Prince Rhaegar, but arrived in King's Landing days after the prince, with no explanation for what had delayed him or his companions. Perhaps it didn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but the mystery gnawed at her. The more she dug into his past, the more questions arose, and it was becoming increasingly apparent that there were layers to Christopher Mudd that remained hidden. When Olenna had the maesters look into House Mudd, they found a wealth of old accounts about the courageous and defiant Mudd River Kings who had resisted the Andals centuries ago. It hardly mattered whether Christopher had any true claim to that bloodline. What mattered was that he had carved out his own path. He had risen not by name, but by action, much as she had. Olenna had not become the Queen of Thorns because she was a daughter of House Redwyne or a wife of House Tyrell. She had built her power with her mind, her ambition, and her will. And that, she could see, was precisely what Christopher had done as well. "My lady," the deep baritone of Left addressed her, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to see one of her 2 personal guards standing at attention, a subtle gesture toward the door. "Maester Lomas, my lady," he announced. Olenna blinked, momentarily disoriented, before her gaze fell on the hesitant figure standing in the doorway. Maester Lomas, holding a missive, was clearly aware of the interruption. She must have been lost in thought longer than she'd realized. The seal on the parchment was one she had only recently become familiar with, a sigil she had yet to grow accustomed to. "A missive from the Lord Hand for you, my lady," Maester Lomas said, his voice polite as always. Olenna bit back the urge to remark on the obviousness of the statement. Instead, she simply waved her hand. "Would you give it to me?" she asked, her tone more weary than sharp. As she stretched out her hand, she caught sight of the lines beginning to etch themselves deeper into her skin. Her once flawless complexion now showed the creeping signs of age, and she suppressed a small grimace at the reminder. Maester Lomis' chains rustled as he stepped forward, handing her the missive with a bow, the customary courtesy that had grown familiar to her over the years. With a flick of her wrist, Olenna produced a small, sharp blade from within the folds of her gown and sliced open the envelope. She saw Maester Lomis flinch at the sight, though he quickly hid it behind a mask of propriety. Olenna wasn't skilled with a blade, but she could manage well enough. If Mace had managed to swing a sword, then she had little doubt that she could handle one, at least for tasks like this. It was certainly more practical than waiting for someone to open her letters for her. She unfurled the letter and skimmed its contents quickly, her eyes narrowing as she read. Lady Olenna Tyrell, I was very grateful when you accepted the betrothal between your granddaughter and the king. This will surely bring us closer to stability, and I believe that together we can achieve much for the future of the Seven Kingdoms and each other. It has not escaped my attention that the Reach, Riverlands and Crownlands now with House Errol and its lands account for near all of food production in the realm. It is unfortunate that trade with Essos has grown more expensive on account of these new pirates that have emerged in the Stepstones. That said, I must admit a concern. Your son seems to be tiring of his leash, and his eyes shine ever brighter with greed. I fear he fails to understand that his lords and commanders are not his to command alone any longer. He is beholden his Grace King Aegon and those wielding the king's voice and actions. I hope that this concern, as well as other small matters, do not hinder a fruitful alliance between our houses. Yours sincerely, Lord Hand Christopher Mudd, Lord Regent and Hand of the King to His Grace King Aegon VI of his name, Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, Lord of Riverrun, Lord of Oldstones. Olenna's lips tightened as she finished reading, her expression flickering between amusement and irritation. The tone was light, but there was an unmistakable sharpness beneath it. His observation about food production was unsubtle. The suggestion, while sure to stir discontent among the other Lord Paramounts, was not without merit. In fact, it could prove highly profitable, especially with the Crown's support and their kingdoms holding such sway over the realm's food production. The other Lord Paramounts were in a weakened position, unable to challenge the combined might of their two kingdoms. If they played their cards right, they could turn this advantage into a fortune, provided they acted in unison. His insinuation that Mace was on a leash, with her as the one holding the reins, was as amusing as it was uncomfortably accurate, and certainly impolite to state so bluntly. That Mace's arrogance was straying beyond her control was no surprise, and her own sources in the capital had already confirmed the matter. Still, her pride stirred at the liberties the Hand had taken with his request, even if he had maintained a courteous tone. Olenna would need to give the matter more thought. An alliance with this new player, if only based on the suggestions he'd laid out, could prove interesting, even advantageous. But she would not tether their future to him without caution. He may think himself clever and powerful now, but should he dare to abuse or betray their trust, the last thing he would know would be just how mistaken he was in provoking her wrath. Mace may be a bumbling oaf, but there was a reason he still sat as Lord of the Reach. The true power lay not in his blundering person, but in the alliances she had forged, the influence she wielded, and the strings she pulled from the shadows. Much like Christopher was the hand behind Aegon's throne, Olenna was the quiet force that kept Mace on his. Christopher sighed, leaning back in his chair as his gaze swept across the scattered reports blanketing his desk. Documents from Riverrun to the far-flung keeps of the Riverlands, all meticulously gathered by Maester Vyman at his request. With Maester Allard's help, he had sifted through the deluge of information, whittling it down from 100 parchments to a manageable stack. Yet even now, as he perused the condensed reports, the full picture of the Riverland's plight was quite bleak. The scars of war ran deep there. Like so many conflicts before, the Riverlands had borne the brunt of battle, with rebel forces stripping royalist granaries bare and pillaging pastures to keep their own armies fed. Royalist riverlords now stood on desolate lands, their stores emptied, their fields ravaged. Still, it was not all bleak news. Summer had arrived, though how long it might grace them was anyone's guess. The last winter had dragged on for 2 years, and with war compounding its toll, many farmers had yet to return to their fields. Crops remained unplanted, herds untended. If this neglect continued, the Riverland's recovery could be delayed for years yet. Still, as Christopher scanned reports detailing a rise in vagrants causing unrest in the depths of Flea Bottom, coupled with the number of aging gold cloaks nearing retirement from the watch, he began to see potential solutions taking shape. The survivors of the Second Battle of the Trident amounted to scarcely half of those who had marched into it. Around 4,000 knights, men-at-arms, and levies had made it through that brutal, decisive clash. Christopher was certain that some of the older men in the watch would be willing to lend a hand. There were fighting men who, despite their years, never laid down their swords for long. Better they fought alongside him than against him. It also reminded him of another vacancy that weighed heavily on his mind, the need to appoint a new commander of the City Watch after the loss of Adam. Even a month later, the wound felt too fresh, the decision too personal. For now, Robin was managing the watch well enough, though Christopher had far greater plans in mind for his cousin. Seeking a distraction from his grief, Christopher picked up the missive he'd received 2 days before. The Wents had finally begun their journey to King's Landing. His betrothed had been on his mind more often than he cared to admit. Setting aside the political stakes, marriage was no light affair, ideally, a once-in-a-lifetime commitment. Though, of course, some older lords made exceptions. Walder Frey came to mind. Lady Sarah was young and fair, but he had come to see from their letters that there was more to her than the usual courtesy and innocence of a maiden. Beneath her words, he glimpsed a cleverness, a spark he hoped would flourish within their marriage. He wanted her to be more than a political piece, more than the mother of his heirs. He wanted her to find purpose by his side. But then he faltered at a sudden thought. How would she receive his son, Tristan? Christopher had no intention of abandoning the boy, but he knew well that Tristan's presence could threaten his alliance with the Wents. He had already decided against seeking legitimization for his son, as much as it pained him. The risks outweighed his wishes, and he would not jeopardize his future or his family's for that desire. Christopher would raise the boy as his own, but a bastard Tristan would remain. His house and his future heirs would need all the security they could muster, and Christopher knew that if he tried to name Tristan as his heir, his family's claim to the Riverlands might not even survive him, let alone pass to his son. In truth, there was little Lady Sarah herself could do to object. Any protest would lie with her family. Lord Walter, in particular, was the one with the power to break the match if he chose, though Christopher hoped his ambition for an alliance with his liege outweighed any dishonor brought upon his daughter. In a perfect world, Christopher's actions should have been his own shame to bear. But he knew well enough from tales of other lords that, too often, the disgrace fell unfairly upon their wives. A knock at his solar door drew him from his thoughts. Christopher straightened, quickly tidying the reports scattered before him. "Enter," he called. The door opened to reveal one of his guards. "Lord Titos Blackwood, my lord," Mern announced as the black-haired lord stepped into the room. Christopher rose, nodding in greeting. "Titos, have they gathered?" "They have," Titos replied. "They await you now." Christopher cast a quick glance at his desk, debating if he should clean them up now, but decided against it. "Lead the way, my friend," he said, gesturing for Titos to accompany him as they left the solar. "Have you been with them already?" Titos gave a brief nod. "I stuck my head in before coming to fetch you." "And how did they seem?" "Not exactly thrilled," Titos replied, a hint of amusement in his tone. "Your gold cloaks surrounding the room may have dampened their spirits somewhat." "Not that they're terribly fond of me as it is," Christopher muttered, though he was taken aback when Titos shook his head. "You might be surprised," Titos replied. "The Royalists had no love for Lord Hoster, and while you may be an outsider, they're still grateful for your efforts on behalf of the Royalist cause, not to mention your standing as hand." Lord Mouton and Lord Darry were seated with Lord Ruger and Sir Cox, all in strong support of you as the new Lord Paramount. Titos paused thoughtfully. "As for Lord Mallister, he seems neutral enough about your ascension, as does Sir Stephen Frey. What his father, Lord Walder, thinks of it all, however, is anyone's guess. Christopher stayed silent for a few moments, processing this unexpected turn. It was a pleasant surprise, he had to admit, a welcome he'd been prepared to earn rather than receive. "And my detractors?" he finally asked. Tytos grimaced. "Bracken, along with Lords Piper and Vance. All three fought for Lord Hoster until the bitter end and have been steadfast supporters of the Tullys for decades. In the Riverlands, alliances are often overshadowed by ancient feuds, but the loyalty that House Tully and Lord Hoster commanded from those three has been rare indeed." Christopher raised an eyebrow, considering. He was well aware of their allegiance to the rebels during the Battle of the Trident, yet he'd received an intriguing offer from Lord Yonos Bracken himself in the aftermath of his appointment as Lord Paramount, a marriage proposal to Lord Yonos' sister, Caitlin Bracken. When he shared this with Tytos, the older man spat. "The two-faced bastard. I hope you declined?" "I am already promised, if you haven't forgotten," Christopher replied with a hint of amusement. Tytos reddened, clearly embarrassed. "Right, of course," he muttered, his irritation with Bracken momentarily clouding his memory. "Not to worry, Tytos," Christopher said, his tone firm. "In my Riverlands, we will not be ruled by disunity and ancient rivalries. We will become a power that none dare slight, a force that none will march across, leaving only rape and chaos in their wake." He had his own plans for addressing the Blackwood-Bracken rivalry, though he knew it would take time and careful maneuvering. Tytos' eyes widened, though he did not manage to respond as they reached the door to the meeting. Entering the room, every lord fell silent, all their eyes falling upon him and Tytos. Lord Darry, Mouton, Ruger and Sir Cox all looked with anticipation. Lord Mallister and Sir Stephen Frey gazed at him with cautious curiosity. Finally Lord Bracken, Piper, and Vance had narrowed eyes. Bracken even sneered as he saw Blackwood at Christopher's side. "My lords and sirs, out of respect for everyone's time, we shall begin," Christopher announced as Tytos took his seat beside Lord Darry and the other royalist lords. "And what kept you, my lord?" came a voice with an unmistakable sneer. Christopher made his way to the head of the table, ignoring the bait. A handful of servants lined the walls, attempting to blend with the stonework, and he gestured for them to bring out the food and refreshments. Only then did he turn to the source of the spiteful query, meeting the irritated, calculating gaze of Lord Lucas Vance. "Lord Vance, if I'm not mistaken?" At Lord Vance's curt nod, Christopher continued. "Then I'll admit, my lord, I was testing you all." Lord Vance's mouth opened, surprise disrupting whatever retort he had prepared. It was clear he'd intended to use Christopher's later rival to suggest that the Hand was neglecting his Riverlands duties for the sake of the crown. But Christopher pressed on, his voice gaining strength. "I can assure you, my lord, I will never be as impotent as the Tullys have been since Lord Edmund's time. For far too long, the other kingdoms have seen the Riverlands as a mere stepping stone, a road to march through in pursuit of their own wars. Each time banners are raised and swords drawn, our lands are trampled and our people suffer. That ends now." Christopher's gaze swept over the room. "I am the Hand of the King, and I assure you, that office is no burden when wielded with purpose. My ancestors ruled these lands for centuries. After their fall, the Riverlands descended into infighting, preyed upon by Ironborn raiders and Stormlander invaders alike. I intend to see the Riverlands restored to their former strength, but for that, I need loyal, diligent vassals." He paused, letting his words settle. "Three horses cannot pull a carriage if one is lame," Christopher said, his tone steady. "We must work together, as one, if we are to forge a land none would dare tread upon, and therefore I need you all to trust me in the knowledge that we all seek a stronger Riverlands." His words left the table in silence. Lord Lucas still wore a defiant scowl but seemed momentarily at a loss for a retort. More interestingly, Christopher noticed Lord Jason Mallister nodding, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Sir Stephen Frey's gaze darted uncertainly between the royalist lords and the former rebels, as if calculating his stance by their reactions. House Frey, ever decisive, he thought dryly. It was a wonder Lord Walder and his brood managed to find their way out of their chambers each morning, considering the glacial speed of their decision-making. Sotorios itself would freeze over before a Frey committed to a side without dragging their limp, sorry selves the entire way. Now, if we're ready to continue, Christopher asked rhetorically, moving forward without waiting for a response. I wish to inform you all that during the war, I negotiated a betrothal with Lord Walter Went for his daughter, Lady Sarah. He noticed Lord Jonas Bracken's frown deepen, no doubt at the reminder of his failed offer. Lord Jason Mallister seemed measured, his expression giving little away, though he appeared relatively content with the choice. Most concerning, however, were the hesitant expressions among the royalists. Lord Roger Ruger, in particular, seemed openly displeased. His aversion was likely due to his distaste for any former rebel houses, no surprise given he had seated himself farthest from Lord Titus Blackwood, despite Blackwood's eventual shift of allegiance near the war's end, while the Wents had only withdrawn to neutrality. Yet the overall reception, if cautious, was within reason. Some would no doubt have preferred to see one of their own kin as Lady Paramount, but Christopher had considered his options carefully. Lady Sarah Went was the most advantageous choice among limited options, despite his brief consideration of Lady Alysanne Blackwood, Tito's sister. However, with the Blackwoods firmly allied already, there was more to gain in strengthening ties with Harrenhal. We will marry within a few moons, he continued, and I hope as many of you as can attend will do so. The Wents have ruled Harrenhal with diligence, and it is crucial, I believe, for the unity and strength of the Riverlands that I ally closely with the holders of that castle. Even in its state of disrepair, Harrenhal remains a strategic stronghold of immense value to us all. Will you share any specific plans for improving our lands? I hear a great many words, but can we expect any true action? Lord Jason Mallister's voice cut through the air, even and clear. To Christopher's ears, it didn't sound overtly antagonistic, more cautious, seeking clarification. Others, however, did not think so. You question our liege lord, Mallister? Lord Raymond Derry's voice rang out in reply, sharp with indignation. It seems this rebellion has not only cost you your honor but your courtesy as well. Christopher barely suppressed the urge to roll his eyes. Did they manage half an hour without resurrecting old slights? My honor, Derry? Lord Jason replied, his voice steely as he rose from his seat, eyes narrowing at the Lord of Derry. Where was your honor when my cousin Geoffrey was burned alive at the Mad King's whim? Jason Mallister stood tall and lean, a knight who had spent countless hours in the yard, his stance more intimidating than most men at rest. His indigo armor gleamed, the Mallister eagle emblazoned proudly on his chest. Raymond Derry, though of a similar height, was wiry and less accustomed to the sword. His life had been spent poring over ledgers and managing estates rather than training for war. Though a knight in name, few would bet on his survival in a duel with Lord Jason, and a duel it was swiftly becoming. Christopher noted Lord Jason's hand drifting to the hilt of his sword, and Lord Raymond's fingers inching into his doublet, no doubt reaching for a concealed dagger. Enough. Christopher's voice rang out, firm and unyielding, though it did little to halt the swift descent into chaos as Lord Jason drew his blade with a scrape of steel. The threat of a true clash was only thwarted by the sudden arrival of gold cloaks flooding the chamber, moving deftly to pull the two men apart and establish control over the room. The lords cursed and protested as the guards separated them, both men straining against restraint until, with visible reluctance, they finally yielded, stepping back with sharp, resentful glares. Around the room, the other lords and knights watched with a mixture of relief and disappointment, having been caught between the thrill of a spectacle and the unease of witnessing it. Christopher let his gaze fall hard on both men. Look at yourselves, he said coldly. Squabbling like children. Is this how the lords of the Riverlands are to act? Are we wildlings? Good gods, have some dignity. For a moment they both still looked belligerent until a glance at the stern gold cloaks around them seemed to disavow them of this notion. They also seemed to realize the situation and refuse to meet anyone's gaze. Now, Christopher continued, his voice crisp with authority, "I'll keep this brief, so we may all soon return to our own duties. I'm certain each of us has places we'd rather be than here." He turned pointedly to Lord Jason. "To answer your question, I do indeed have specific plans, and by day's end, I can provide you with an outline. For now, though, consider this meeting an introduction, rather than a more detailed council of some kind." Lord Jason nodded, his expression taut but respectful. Christopher's gaze then shifted to Lord Raymond. "As for you, Lord Darry, this quarrel is precisely the kind of division that serves only to weaken us. All our enemies need is one whispered word to fan the fires and drag the Riverlands into another spiral of infighting. That will not happen under my lordship." A ripple of uneasy assent passed around the table as Christopher paused, allowing his words to settle. Finally, he said, turning back to the gathered lords, "There are presently 2 open places in the King's Guard, which I intend to fill with rivermen. If any among you have kin or retainers suitable for this high honor, I ask that you notify Lord Commander Hightower, who will select among them. With that, I thank you all for your attention, and you are dismissed." With murmurs and subtle nods, the lords rose to leave, most casting wary but contemplative glances at Christopher as they filed out, the weight of his words lingering long after they had departed. As the last lord, Mouton, disappeared through the doorway, Christopher allowed himself a sigh, though he scarcely had a moment's peace before a familiar face poked into the room. "Your meeting with Lord Redwine is coming up shortly," Robin remarked with a wry smile. "So, shall you have your luncheon before or after? It would be tragic for you to starve to death just as you're settling into your role as Lord Paramount." His tone was light, a welcome reprieve from the tension that had filled the chamber moments before. Christopher chuckled. "Starving might almost be preferable after that spectacle, if I never have to endure it again." He glanced at the now vacant chairs with a wry smile. "But I suppose a meal beforehand wouldn't hurt. I'll need all the energy I can get dealing with all these lords." Robin smirked. "A wise choice. I'll have something sent up to your tower immediately. Just don't make Lord Redwine wait too long. Somehow, I imagine he'd be even less inclined to patience than your vassals." "Right you are. We'll see each other later, cousin," he said, bidding Robin farewell as he passed him on the way out of the room. Drawing on his now extensive knowledge of the Red Keep, he made his way toward the Tower of the Hand and his solar. A week had passed since his introduction to the feuding lords who were now his vassals. Even the royalists, those ostensibly aligned with his rule, were lukewarm, at best, about his new role as their liege lord. They were, however, optimistic that his steadfast support during the rebellion would incline him to favor them in their endless clashes and disputes with each other. Already, he had found himself mediating yet another tiresome argument between the Blackwoods and the Brackens over the contested land known as the Teats, a pair of barren hills that had been a thorn between the 2 houses since the reign of Aegon IV. They were but 2 miserable hills on unyielding soil, overlooking a stunted village that boasted fewer than 100 souls. The land was poor, barren, and yet each lord would sooner see his line extinguished than yield an inch of it to his ancient rival. The Blackwoods and Brackens contested it in every season, in every generation, sometimes with words, often with swords. This old feud had only gotten worse since Aegon IV's day, when he took the land from the Brackens and gave it to the Blackwoods after swapping his mistress Barbara Bracken for Melissa Blackwood. Nominally, the Blackwoods held the Teats now and had since the unworthy, but the Brackens had never stopped trying to get them back. A week had passed since his introduction to the feuding lords who were now his vassals. Even the royalists, those ostensibly aligned with his rule, were lukewarm, at best, about his new role as their liege lord. They were, however, optimistic that his steadfast support during the rebellion would incline him to favor them in their endless clashes and disputes with each other. Already, he had been forced to mediate yet another tiresome argument between the Blackwoods and the Brackens over the barren hills known as the Teats, a piece of land both miserable and cursed, squabbled over since the reign of Aegon the Unworthy. The hills were little more than rocky humps on hard-packed soil, looming over a stunted village of barely 100 souls. The land was poor, barren, and yet each lord would sooner see his line extinguished than yield an inch of it to his ancient rival. The Blackwoods and Brackens contested it in every season, in every generation, sometimes with words, often with swords. Their feud had only deepened since the days of Aegon IV, when the king wrested the teats from the Brackens and granted them to the Blackwoods after discarding his mistress Barbara Bracken in favour of her rival, Melissa Blackwood. For generations now, the Blackwoods had held the land in name, though the Brackens had never ceased in their attempts to reclaim it. Still driven by the wishes and grievances of men who should have been forgotten a long time ago, but were kept alive out of hatred. Most of the disputed lands were currently under the control of Lord Tytos, whose house had held them for years. The Tullys had generally leaned toward the Brackens, partly because they shared the same religion, but they hadn't committed to backing one side fully. The result was a lingering stalemate, with each attempt at peacekeeping only serving to remind both families of how much they despised each other. Christopher realized that his earlier notions, tax incentives for those willing to compromise, fines for those who would not, were feeble tools for the task at hand. This was no petty quarrel to be bought off with coin or choked by tariffs. For a peace that would last, he'd need something stronger than numbers and laws. He'd need blood. The idea of marriage crept in, reluctant at first, then stubborn as any Bracken or Blackwood. Lord Tytos had a son, young Brynden, barely 2 name days but hale and strong. Lord Yonos, on the other hand, had 2 daughters. Barbara, the elder at 3, and the little Jane, barely a babe. A marriage alliance, Brynden Blackwood betrothed to a Bracken girl, might be the only chance of binding the 2 houses to a common cause and a common name. For all the venom exchanged between the Blackwoods and Brackens, neither had shed the other's blood in 3 generations. The feud had chilled, simmering instead of boiling over, kept alive in barbed words and bitter glances. But perhaps this chill, this lull after centuries of open warfare, was what they needed to forge peace, if the lords would allow it. There lay the true crux of it. Christopher knew well that convincing them would be no simple task. A Bracken yielding to a Blackwood, or vice versa, was as rare as summer snow in dawn. But if both lords could see beyond their ancient hatreds, the feud may end with some decisive action. He would even consider forcing the issue. It was one of the premier disagreements in the Riverlands, and if that could be solved, then that would surely fill confidence in his abilities as their liege lord. The mediation had ended, as it always had before, in frustration and empty words, and Christopher had dismissed the warring lords with a final, weary gesture. A few days later he had been standing before the court. He had announced the 2 new members of the Kingsguard. First was Sir Desmond Mallister, Lord Jason's uncle, a knight of 4 and 40 name days, known for his skill with a blade and his even temperament. He was described by all who had met him as kind and humble, a man who understood the weight of his oaths and carried them with quiet resolve, a worthy knight. The second appointment, however, was far more contentious. Sir Jamus Blackwood, Lord Tytos' youngest brother, had only recently passed his 20th name day, but his skill with a sword was already well regarded. Still, to Christopher's mind, his selection was less about his abilities and more about the politics of the moment. Jamus was a pawn in a larger game, a means to bind Lord Tytos to him, to secure his allegiance in the years to come. Where Sir Desmond's appointment was a gesture of peace, aimed at drawing Lord Jason closer to the crown and to discouraging any rebellious thoughts, Jamus' selection was more naked in its intent. It was a bribe, plain and simple, to indebt Lord Tytos to him. The decision to appoint Jamus had caused an immediate stir. Lord Yonos Bracken, unable to swallow the slight, had packed up and departed the capital in a huff, his retainers departing at first light. The rejection of his sister's marriage proposal, followed by the appointment of his rival's brother to the Kingsguard, had been more than he could bear. The court buzzed with gossip, murmurs of how the Blackwoods seemed to rise ever higher in favour, while the Brackens, once powerful, were being steadily sidelined. Christopher did his best to quiet these whispers, framing the matter as one of loyalty, between royalists and rebels, though in truth, he knew where his own sympathies lay. While he needed to appear balanced, he was of course partial to Blackwood as his first ally among the nobles ever since Harrenhal. That Lord Titos had thanked him for driving Lord Ionos from the capital only showed where public sentiment and understanding lay, though Christopher hadn't intended it that way. Yet he hadn't gone out of his way to appease Lord Ionos either, letting the Bracken Lord leave with his grievances intact. It was not an easy situation. "My lord?" Christopher turned swiftly toward the entrance of his solar, finding his guard Kennet standing there, looking slightly awkward. "Lord Mace Tyrell is here, asking to speak with you," Kennet announced. Christopher's gaze flickered to his desk, then back to the guard. "Give me a moment, then show him in." "As you wish, my lord," Kennet replied, disappearing through the doorway. Christopher crossed to his desk, taking up a letter and slipping it into a small, hidden drawer within the wood. The latch clicked shut just as the door swung open. Lord Mace Tyrell entered, his footsteps heavy on the stone floor. He was not yet fat, though the years, and his appetites, were plainly catching up with him. His doublet was deep green, embroidered with golden roses that climbed across his chest, the fabric pulled tight over his broadening waist. At his side hung a sword on a belt studded with bright jewels, the leather stretched to its limits. A fine blade, no doubt, though it had to be gathering dust, in the half-year since their first meeting in the Kingswood, a time that felt an age ago. Christopher had yet to see Tyrell draw it. He watched Lord Mace's expression carefully. Christopher had postponed this meeting more times than he could count, first before and then after his final campaign against Robert Baratheon. Now it was time, however. Mace's dark brows were slightly furrowed, his brown eyes somewhat stormy, though Christopher couldn't say if it was from the climb up the stairs or offense. "Lord Christopher, I am grateful we are finally able to speak," Mace began, a touch of bluster in his tone. "These times have been hectic, unprecedented, really, and, yes, quite unorthodox. So while I won't criticize the delay, as Lord Paramount, it did come across as, let us say, almost insulting." He rambled on, his words circling around what he meant without landing on it. Christopher didn't need more than a moment to see through it. Mace was undoubtedly stung by the delay, his sense of importance left unappreciated. Not that Christopher had done much to accommodate him. He'd been waiting on certain matters before this meeting could serve him any purpose. He resisted the urge to glance at the hidden drawer where the letter lay. Instead, he rose to his feet, a show of deference that would not be lost on Mace. "Lord Tyrell, I must admit, the oversight is entirely mine. I am grateful for your patience and sincerely hope you'll accept my apologies for the inconvenience. Please, take a seat, I've cleared my evening for us to speak without interruption." A flash of surprise crossed Mace's face, but the irritation in his eyes softened, replaced by a hint of satisfaction. Mace was a man who took pleasure in gestures, in courtesies that affirmed his importance. A seat, an apology, an evening set aside, all simple concessions. And it was almost too easy. Well, of course. The hand of the king must have matters pulling him every which way," Lord Mace replied, recovering with a stiff nod. "I suppose we can put it behind us, no harm done. Consider it friendly advice, though, to avoid such delays in the future. It wouldn't do to let small matters sour relations that should be strong and steady, He eased himself into the chair opposite Christopher, exuding a self-satisfied air as though his words held the weight of wise counsel. "Wise words indeed, Lord Tyrell," Christopher replied smoothly. "I'll be sure it doesn't happen again." Reaching for a bottle of Arbor Gold, he poured a glass for each of them, raising an eyebrow as he set Mace's goblet before him. At the sight of the wine, Mace's face lit up in a wide smile. "Ah, Arbor Gold. I dare say it wouldn't hurt, a fine vintage, I assume, if my good brother saw fit to send it your way." Christopher gave a small, knowing smile. "I would assure you it won't disappoint, but I suspect you're the expert in such matters." Mace chuckled, clearly pleased, and raised his glass. "Well, not to boast, but I might claim to be the most knowledgeable of Arbor Gold, save perhaps the red wines and their brewers. Visiting the Arbor is always a pleasure, though I'll admit there are certain advantages to being their liege lord." They both laughed politely, though Christopher felt the hollowness of it settling between them. How utterly false this exchange was, each laugh as carefully crafted as the embroidery on Mace's doublet. And yet, here they were, playing the game all the same. Even Mace seemed to tire of the empty pleasantries, his smile shrinking to a thin, polite line. "Now, Christopher, if I may call you that?" Christopher nodded, though the thought of any familiarity with Tyrell was enough to turn his stomach. Mace's smile shifted, growing faintly condescending, likely the most genuine expression he'd worn all evening. "I must admit, you've exceeded all expectations in the royalist cause, especially given your youth. Quite the feat, landing yourself a Lord Paramountship on top of it. Impressive indeed. But," he leaned in, eyes gleaming with something almost triumphant, "do you not think it wise to cut your losses now? With everything to lose, no man stays lucky forever. It takes but one misstep for a house to fall." Christopher held his silence, his gaze steady as Mace's smile turned sharper. "All this is to say," Mace continued, "that for your own sake, I suggest you step down as Hand. In return, I would, of course, support your claim to the Riverlands, unorthodox as it is. Some might call it a concerning precedent, after all." He finished at last, the full weight of his offer, or threat, now laid between them. So that was it. Mace Tyrell wanted him out as Hand, though to what end, Christopher couldn't be sure. Perhaps Mace imagined himself in the role, or maybe he simply saw an opportunity and aimed to exploit it. Whatever his reasons, it was a complication Christopher couldn't allow. Too much of his strategy depended on the influence that came with the handship, an influence he certainly wouldn't trust to Mace Tyrell or any lackey Mace might prop up. Christopher reminded himself, he was still Lord Regent. By rights, this should trump the Hand, though it was true such power had never been split before. It brought the risk of interference, of vetoes, of power plays he couldn't afford. No, he thought. That would not do. "And who would you suggest as Hand in my stead, Lord Mace?" Christopher's tone was measured, calm, though his gaze did not waver. "Yourself? Or perhaps a Dornishman, Oberyn, or one of his vassals? Would that truly suit you, I wonder?" Mace's expression faltered, but Christopher continued, pressing his advantage. "I am not unreasonable, far from it. Whatever it is you wish to secure, surely you understand that I am in a position to negotiate. Tell me, what could you accomplish as Hand that I could not offer you now, without you assuming the role yourself?" He poured himself a measured sip of wine, letting the words sink in before he leaned forward. "The Handship, after all, is no crown, it merely paints a target on one's back. Consider the weight of that, in your own position. The Reach may appear unified, yet Hightower and Florent have been uncommonly quiet of late, have they not? A few carefully placed words from unfriendly mouths, and things could turn difficult in your homeland." The glint of confidence in Mace's eyes flickered, giving way to a shadow of unease. It was, after all, every Tyrell lord's greatest fear, one that had haunted them since the fall of Housegardener in the Conquest, and sharpened after the Dance of the Dragons, the fear that their own bannermen, never quite loyal, would one day rise against them. Many Reach houses boasted blood ties to the Gardeners, ties closer and purer than the Tyrrells themselves, and they never let the Tyrrells forget it. No marriage alliance or lavish feast could erase the whispers, the quiet reminder that House Tyrell had been granted their seat, not by ancient right, but by Targaryen favor. Furthermore, Christopher said, sliding open the concealed drawer and retrieving the letter within. "In my recent correspondence with Lady Olenna, I believe we reached some intriguing agreements, ones that could benefit both our houses immensely." Mace's composure wavered entirely as Christopher slid the letter across the table, the broken Tyrell seal gleaming faintly in the candlelight. With a steady hand, Christopher tapped the lines outlining the proposed ventures, a duopoly on the food supply and favorable trade agreements that Maester Allard had unearthed in his relentless reports on the Riverlands state. "See here, Lord Mace," Christopher continued smoothly. "Together, we could control the lion's share of the food supply across the realm, setting prices as we see fit. A powerful asset in times such as these, wouldn't you agree? And these trade agreements. They would serve both our needs at rates far more agreeable than anything the free cities could offer. Mace's mouth opened, but for a moment, no words came. He scanned the letter as if to look for signs of forgery, but was ultimately only met with writing he recognized as his mother, the Queen of Thorns. Having Lady Olenna keep Lord Mace out of the loop of their negotiations had been laughably easy in comparison to convincing her of the benefits of these negotiations in the first place. The dysfunctionality was obvious, and in this case something that Christopher managed to punish Lord Mace with. It put him completely on the back foot, the letter almost a chastisement that a mother give her child even if it never even mentioned him. The embarrassment of his obliviousness of it was enough. Slowly, Mace closed his mouth, swallowing his initial response. Christopher leaned forward, delivering the final stroke. "This whole conversation can be forgotten, no harm done, right?" he said, throwing Mace's own words back at him with a faint smile. "We could be the closest of allies, Lord Mace, the strongest of friends. You will be the king's good father, after all, no one will question your influence in the capital, handship or no." He let the words settle for a moment, watching Mace's expression shift, his shock replaced by a more calculating look. "In addition," Christopher continued, "I will not interfere with your appointees in court, nor will I obstruct your placements in the royal household, provided we come to an agreement that you'll refrain from the gold cloaks and the harbour staff. A fair compromise, don't you think?" Lord Mace held Christopher's gaze for what felt like a full minute, as though weighing every word spoken, every subtle shift in tone. Christopher simply leaned back, allowing the silence to stretch. He could see he had already won. Mace's eyes betrayed the calculation, the shifting assessment. Mace was merely waiting now, drawing out the pause to appear more cautious than he truly was, and to give himself time to search for any hidden trap in the deal. Not that he'd find any. For now, Christopher had no reason to throw away this alliance. The arrangement served him well, and if Mace benefited from it too, so be it. Finally, Mace nodded, his lips pursed in what he perhaps hoped appeared to be measured acceptance. "Well, then. I believe we may have an understanding. My sincerest apologies for this unfortunate misunderstanding." Christopher inclined his head, his voice smooth and forgiving. "No harm done, my lord. Words are wind, after all. What matters now is what we can accomplish together." He paused, letting a note of formality slip back in. "I would, however, seek clarification that this means I have your support for my claim on the Riverlands?" A flicker of something unreadable passed across Mace's face before he managed a warm, obliging smile. "Of course, Lord Christopher. House Tyrell is, as ever, the firmest supporter of the crown, and it is only natural that we accept its judgments. Your claim has Tyrell backing." "Wonderful," Christopher said, rising to his feet with a smooth, almost courteous smile. "Then I won't keep you any longer, if that's all. I trust the Arbor Gold met your expectations?" Lord Mace followed suit, his expression polite but somewhat strained, as though still turning over the conversation in his mind. "Indeed, a fine vintage," he said, with just a hint of an exaggerated nod. "Your hospitality was much appreciated." Christopher inclined his head, his smile tight. "It was my pleasure, my lord. Until next time." As Tyrell departed with a final nod, Christopher watched him closely, his gaze unwavering until the man was well out of sight. Only then did he collapse back into his seat, a sigh escaping him. He was both exhausted and elated, the weight of the conversation lifting from his shoulders. It was a strange, almost intoxicating thrill, the calculated dance between lords. The power play, the manipulations, it all felt like a game he was born to play. In the end, he had secured Tyrell's support for his claim and retained the handship, with minimal concessions. The Tyrell influence would undoubtedly grow in the coming years, especially with the betrothal he'd arranged between the king and Lady Marjorie. But better to have them as allies than rivals. Christopher pulled out another parchment from one of the drawers of his desk, his fingers tracing the names scrawled across it, some marked with a bold strike through, others left untouched. Redwine, Grafton, Estamont, Cox, Mouton, Errol, Manderley, Liddon, Lefford, Hayford. All crossed out. These were the names of lords with whom he'd already had meetings with, ranging from brief introductions to more drawn-out negotiations. He had already managed to seal deals with Redwyne and Manderley, agreements on salt and timber, respectively, but Christopher's thoughts turned to other, more ambitious schemes. One idea that had been occupying his mind was the prospect of domestic wine production in the Riverlands. The region, rich in fertile land and favorable climates, was suited for it, yet it remained dependent on costly imports. With the right incentives, he believed he could encourage local lords to invest in vineyards, sparing the kingdom the heavy toll of foreign wine. The potential profits were undeniable, and more importantly, it would free up considerable gold for other ventures he had in mind. But there was a risk. The Redwynes, if they felt threatened, could easily turn antagonistic. Christopher was no fool. He knew the power of an old house's reputation, especially one as rooted as the Redwynes. Stirring trouble there could jeopardize everything. It was all a delicate balance. It would all take time, however. For now, his next obligation was the reception ceremony for the Wents and his betrothed, who would be arriving within the week. Christopher ran a hand through his hair, leaning back in his chair with a weary sigh. Everything seemed to be falling into place, plans were unfolding, alliances were forming, but there was a lingering sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that the other shoe was about to drop. Lady Sarah Went gazed out the small window of the carriage, her delicate features set in a faint grimace. The closer they drew to King's Landing, the more prominent the city's infamous stench became, even through the thick wood and velvet lining of the carriage. It was a sour mix of humanity and filth, a far cry from the cleaner airs of Harrenhal or Riverrun. She had never travelled farther than Riverrun before now. Her last true journey had been 8 years ago, when she and her father attended Lady Caitlin Tully's betrothal announcement to Lord Brandon Stark. That occasion, filled with feasting and grandeur, seemed a lifetime ago. Though it had ended quite dramatically when Lord Hoster's ward at the time had fought Lord Brandon in a duel and been wounded greatly. Since then, her world had shrunk to Harrenhal. The grand tournament had drawn lords and knights from across the realm, but its aftermath, the war, had left little chance for her to travel. Until now. Once again, her journey concerned a betrothal, but this time, it was her own. Christopher's letters had been a rare solace in those bleak days when news from the warfront was scarce. During the long stretches when he could not write, anxiety gnawed at her. The thought of him, of their future, was one of the few threads she could cling to as the tragedies of her family piled higher. Her 3 elder brothers had perished at the First Battle of the Trident, their lives claimed within hours of each other. Her uncle Oswell had fallen during the storming of Storm's End, and only a moon ago, her father and youngest brother had fallen ill. Though the Maester assured her they were recovering, the fear of loss lingered like a spectre. It had been too close, too much, and the possibility of being left with only her mother haunted her. In the stillness of the carriage, her thoughts drifted to the dark history of Harrenhal, the stories whispered since her youth. Magdalene Lothston, the sorceress Alice Rivers, and the curse, whispered of in every hall, that clung to her family's home like ivy to stone. Once, she had dismissed such stories as fancies meant to frighten children, but now they seemed chillingly real. Could so many tragedies be mere chance? She no longer thought so. Yet soon, Harrenhal would no longer be her home. Riverrun awaited her, a new chapter, a new life. Across from her sat her mother, silent and clad in all black as she had since the death of her brothers. Sarah herself wore a muted dress of blue and grey, a quieter nod to mourning, meant to signal her transition to a brighter future. Beside her, Septa Joaos muttered soft prayers, her hands folded over her prayer beads. Her voice rose and fell in a soothing rhythm, preparing herself, and perhaps Sarah as well, for their arrival in the capital. As the carriage and their entourage passed through the massive walls of the city, Sarah found herself thankfully distracted from her darker musings. The sounds of King's Landing washed over her, clamoring voices, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, and the faint, ever-present din of the city's vast populace. The mingled scents of fish, dung, and smoke were a stark reminder of where she was, yet even these could not dull the flicker of anticipation rising within her. Her thoughts turned to Christopher. Soon, she would see him again, not through the ink of letters but in the flesh. There was nervousness, yes, questions that danced at the edge of her mind about what he might think of her, of what their life together would become. But hope swelled, pushing aside those worries, or at least muting them. Formed around the carriage, a host of golden-cloaked riders kept pace, their polished helms and breastplates glinting in the waning light. They rode in practiced formation, their presence a firm barrier between the carriage and the throngs of curious small folk that lined the streets, straining for a glimpse of the newcomers. Suddenly, the blinds in front of Sarah's window were pulled down without warning, cutting off her view. Septuagint, who had closed them, settled back into her seat, her expression unreadable. Sarah felt indignation rise swiftly in her chest, and her lips parted to demand an explanation. Before she could speak, a hand clamped firmly onto her leg, startling her. Her mother's hand. Sarah turned to find her mother's face calm, her dark eyes sharp and unyielding. The pressure of her grip was steady but undeniable, a wordless command. Sarah's indignation faltered under the weight of it. "Settle down, Sarah," her mother said sharply, her voice cutting through the cramped space of the carriage like a blade. "You are a lady, not a rabid dog. Compose yourself." Sarah stiffened, the heat of indignation replaced by a flush of embarrassment. She bit her tongue, her gaze falling to her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Do you believe Lord Mudd will find these outbursts endearing?" Lady Went continued, her tone cold and deliberate. "A lord's wife must be poised, steady, above such petty shows of temper. Especially here, in the capital. Every eye will be on you, and tongues wag with far less cause than this." Sarah didn't miss her mother's pointed use of Christopher's title, but before she could question it, her mother cut through her thoughts with a sharp command. "I will have some words with you now, without outside eyes peeking in, young lady." Lady Went's voice was firm, but there was a tremor beneath it, an undercurrent of emotion that betrayed her polished exterior. Sarah's back straightened instinctively. "Mother, my family has been ravaged," Lady Went pressed on, her voice tightening. "My sons," the words broke off abruptly, replaced by a strangled sob. Her mother's hand went to her mouth as though to trap the sound, but it escaped nonetheless, raw and ugly. An awkward silence followed, broken only by the rustle of Septuagint's retrieving a handkerchief and handing it to Lady Went. Sarah watched as her mother, always so composed, blew her nose hard and dabbed at her eyes. The sight was jarring, almost unthinkable, yet here it was, grief laid bare. Lady Went regained herself after a few strained moments. When she spoke again, her voice was tight but resolute. "And now, to lose you as well," she said bitterly, her gaze fixed on the covered window as if she could glare at the city beyond and Christopher personally. "To this upstart hand your father was tricked into giving you to. Can you not see it, Sarah? This cannot end well. He has no understanding of our world, no appreciation for the game and its rules. The game is cruel to the ignorant, and his luck," her voice cracked, though she pressed on, "his luck will run out. When it does, you will bear the cost of his mistakes. I cannot bear the thought of losing yet another child. I would have nothing left." Sarah sat stunned for a moment, her mother's words twisting like knives in her chest. Yet beneath the pain, a flicker of defiance rose. "He cares for me, mother," she said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "Can you not see that? Why else would he choose me, when he could have any lady in the realm? As Hand of the King, his choices are hardly limited." Her mother turned on her then, dark eyes glinting with a mix of frustration and sorrow. "Can you not see how you wound me with this insistence?" she said, shaking her head. "You are still young, still naive, but have I taught you nothing? Do you think care will protect you when the wolves come circling around your husband?" "I am not a fool," Sarah said, her voice steadier now, the heat rising in her chest. "I know the risks, but have you not considered that I may help him? Do you think me a thoughtless maiden, blind to everything around her, to the dangers, to the stakes?" Her mother's lips thinned into a pale line, but she said nothing. The silence hung heavy in the confined space of the carriage, more telling than any words could be. "I am a woman now, mother," Sara said, her voice firm, though not unkind. "And it is my choice to marry him. Father accepted it, and I will not betray both his and my own wishes because of your endless fears. What would become of me if I listened to you? Would you lock me away at Harrenhal, a forgotten ward, or perhaps send me to a sept and expect me to find happiness there? No, mother. This is my life, and I will live it as I see fit." Her mother's face darkened, the words clearly stinging, but Sara did not flinch. The desperation in her mother's voice was heartbreaking, but it would not sway her now. She had made her choice. In her mind's eye, she could already picture Christopher, his broad shoulders and handsome face, his presence as familiar as the dance they had shared all those years ago. She breathed deeply, trying to recall the scent of him, warm, earthy, and comforting, until it replaced the choking stench of King's Landing. For all her mother's fears, Sara knew what she wanted, and it was not a life bound by caution and regret. With this resolve firm in her mind, Sara reached up to open the blinds once more. Outside, the winding streets of King's Landing stretched below them as the carriage and its escort slowly ascended the hill. In the distance, the imposing red stone walls of the Red Keep loomed, its towers rising higher with every turn of the wheels. As they neared the gatehouse, Sara's eyes were drawn to the gruesome sight of skulls mounted on spikes, the remnants of traitors executed during the war. The sight was unsettling, but she swallowed the rising bile in her throat and managed to keep her composure. She was no stranger to death and its aftermath any longer. After all, she had seen the lifeless bodies of her 3 elder brothers, upon their return from the Trident as they were laid to rest. She remained pensive as the carriage finally crossed into the courtyard of the Red Keep, her heart fluttering with the weight of what lay ahead. As a girl, she had only dreamed of stepping foot in this grand place. Now, here she was, surrounded by the stone walls that held so much history. The courtyard was alive with movement, dozens of men and women, lords, ladies, servants, and guards, ready to receive her. Sara took a deep breath, her fingers instinctively smoothing the folds of her dress, making sure everything was in place. For a moment, a fleeting doubt gnawed at her: was her dress too plain, too understated? But before she could dwell on it further, she realized there was no time for such concerns now. The carriage swung around, the grand entrance of the Red Keep coming into view, and before she knew it, they were facing the line of lords and ladies, their expectant gazes already fixed on her arrival. The door to the carriage swung open all too soon, chasing away the shadows that had clung to her in the dimness. Her mother stepped out first, followed by Septa Joaos, and then Sara, emerging last with a quiet but resolute step. As her eyes adjusted to the bright daylight, they instinctively began searching the line of onlookers. It didn't take long before her gaze locked with his. He stood at the far left, his strong frame unmistakable among the gathered nobility. The moment their eyes met, his expression softened, his unique blue-green eyes lighting up with an unmistakable warmth. She made a beeline for him, her eyes never leaving his figure as she passed her mother and Septa, lightly disregarding some formality she couldn't even recall now. The rule seemed trivial in that moment. All that mattered was him. Suppressing the overwhelming urge to throw herself into his arms, she instead extended her hand toward him, her fingers trembling slightly. Christopher took it in his calloused hand with a firm but gentle grip, and after a heartbeat, he pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. The warmth of his lips sent a flutter through her chest, and as his eyes held hers, a deep reassurance washed over her. Any lingering doubt, whether their letters, their words, had been mere games or empty promises, vanished entirely. A genuine smile spread across her lips, and for the first time in what felt like an age, Sara felt the knot of anxiety within her loosen. There was no pretending in this moment. This was real. His eyes glittered with a mix of amusement and something warmer, but after a brief moment, they shifted past her. Leaning in slightly, his voice dropped to a quiet, teasing tone. "I believe, my lady, that you must move along the line, lest we create a scene," he murmured, a playful smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The gentle reminder, though light-hearted, brought Sarah back to reality. She blinked, realizing that the formalities had not yet concluded, and a slight flush colored her cheeks. With a soft nod, she took a small step back, though her fingers still lingered in his hand for a heartbeat longer before she gracefully withdrew. Sarah barely registered the formal introductions as they passed by. Lord Mace Tyrell, the Master of Coin, Lord Lucerys Velaryon, the Master of Ships, Prince Oberyn Martell, whose reputation preceded him, and even the young Lord Renly Baratheon. Each one offered a polite nod and kissed her knuckles, their presence a blur as she mindlessly moved along the line. Her thoughts, however, remained fixed on Christopher, replaying the brief but charged moment they'd shared. But when she was finally introduced to Sir Robin, Christopher's cousin, everything shifted. This was the first introduction that truly grabbed her attention. She had heard of him in Christopher's letters, and had briefly glimpsed him during the tourney, along with Christopher's late friend Adam. The news of Adam's tragic death had saddened her, and though she would never voice it aloud, a large part of her had been more relieved that it had not been Christopher who had fallen. Now, standing before her, Sir Robin exuded a playful confidence, his smile full of mischief. "My lady, a pleasure to finally meet you," he said with a bow, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "I think Christopher has been anticipating this meeting more than anything else these last few weeks," he chuckled softly, his tone warm and teasing, as though he were in on a private joke. "Please, call me Sarah," she replied with a smile, hoping to set a more personal tone. If there was one thing she wanted besides the obvious, it was a good relationship with Christopher's cousin. "Only if you call me Robin," he grinned, his voice warm. "Now, I heard your father and brother had caught a sickness recently?" The sudden change in his expression made Sarah's smile falter slightly. "A moon ago," she said, her tone sobering. "It delayed our departure. What was thought to be a mild cold never seemed to go away. Eventually, we decided to leave with just my mother and me. Our maester wrote to say they are recovering, though, so hopefully, they'll be back to health soon enough." Robin nodded in sympathy, his expression softening. "Of course, I hope they're well soon." Sarah looked over her shoulder as Robin subtly glanced past her. "Ah, I think I see Christopher calling for your attention," he said, his voice light once again. Sure enough, Christopher stood a short distance away, flanked by two guards wearing the mud coat of arms, his gaze locked on her. Robin flashed her a playful smile. "I'll handle your baggage and your mother, Sarah. I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to speak again soon." With that, he gave a small bow and made his way toward her mother and the rest of their entourage, leaving Sarah to walk toward Christopher. It was shocking to her how lordly he appeared. She had read his letters detailing the final battle and his victory in claiming Sir Lyn Corbray's legendary Valyrian blade, but seeing it in person, its emerald gleaming from the hilt, was still difficult to believe. The sword hung at his side, a symbol of his strength and status. His brown doublet, emblazoned with the mud crown on his breast, and the golden cape draped over his shoulder, only heightened the impression. If he were to wear a crown, Sarah thought, she would scarcely doubt that he was already a king in his own right, not merely the hand of the king. "My lady," he greeted, his voice warm but measured as she approached. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then dipped into a brief bow, unsure of the exact protocol but hoping it was appropriate. "My lord," she replied softly, meeting his gaze. A faint smile curved his lips as he nodded toward the entrance of one of the towers. "There's no need for such formality between us, Sarah," he said warmly, but his expression shifted, growing more serious. "There is something I need to show you, something that cannot wait any longer." His words only deepened her anxiety. What could he be hiding? Whatever it was, it seemed important enough that he had chosen this moment to reveal it. She forced a reassuring smile, masking her unease, and allowed him to guide her by the arm toward the tower. They walked across the bustling courtyard in silence. The sound of boots on stone and the faint murmur of onlookers were the only interruptions until her mother's chaperone hurried to join them, completing the escort alongside Christopher's guards. "The Tower of the Hand," Christopher began, gesturing to the structure as they approached. It holds my quarters, my solar, and the rooms for my attending servants and guards. It's where I spend most of my time when court matters do not demand my presence elsewhere. So this was where she would be living during her time in King's Landing, once they were married, of course. The thought brought a mix of emotions, curiosity, apprehension, and an underlying hope. They climbed the steps in silence, the shadow of the tower stretching long and heavy over them as the sun dipped lower in the sky. When the guard swung the iron-banded door open, Christopher glanced at her, his face a mask she could not read, then stepped inside without a word. She followed, her footsteps swallowed by the stone. The stairwell spiraled upwards past the barracks, where a pair of soldiers murmured over a game of dice, then past the servants' quarters, a bustling kitchen alive with the scent of bread and roasting meat, and a smoky mess hall where the scrape of chairs and low voices drifted through the narrow space. They reached the third floor, and at the end of a dim corridor, Christopher stopped before a nondescript wooden door. A guard stood sentinel, his armor dull in the flickering light surrounding them. "Is he inside?" Christopher asked, his voice low. "Just returned from visiting the Princess Rhaenys and the king, my lord," the guard answered, with a quick glance at her. She furrowed her brow. He? There was someone waiting for her? Someone she had yet to hear of, it seemed. Before she could speak, Christopher turned to her, his expression tinged with something unusual, anxiety, perhaps. The door creaked open as the guard pushed it, and they stepped into a chamber bathed in the warm glow of late afternoon. Her eyes swept the room, and understanding dawned at once. It was a child's room. A carved wooden knight stood on a low table by the window, and a play sword lay abandoned beside a pile of brightly painted blocks. In the corner, perched on a low, unmade bed, sat a boy who could not have seen more than 5 name days. Perhaps closer to 3, she thought, comparing him to memories of her younger brother at that age. But it wasn't his size or the soft tumble of chestnut-brown curls framing his cherubic face that struck her. No, it was his eyes, green-blue and striking. Her stomach twisted, a sinking, hollow sensation taking root. The boy's gaze alighted on Christopher, and in an instant, those luminous eyes brightened with delight. He leapt from the bed, the small leather-bound book he'd been clutching falling forgotten to the floor. His feet carried him across the room with all the reckless determination of youth. "Father!" the boy cried, flinging himself into Christopher's arms. The word hit her like a physical blow. Her breath caught, her knees unsteady beneath her. Feeling light-headed, she leaned against the door frame. Christopher caught the boy in a firm embrace, lifting him as though he weighed nothing. The softness in his expression, the way he held the child, made her chest tighten further. She couldn't look away from the scene, though every instinct begged her to. Eventually, Christopher turned to her, the boy now settled comfortably in his arms, one small hand clutching at his father's collar. 2 pairs of striking green-blue eyes, so alike it was almost unnerving, fixed on her at once, one curious, the other faintly cautious. "Sarah," Christopher began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something unreadable, "meet my natural-born son, Tristan." He shifted the boy slightly, who was now peeking at her with open curiosity. "Tristan, this is my betrothed, Lady Sarah Went." The name hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp and heavy. Forcing her face into a mask of calm, she inclined her head slightly, managing to summon a faint smile that felt brittle at the edges. "Tristan," she said softly, the boy's name unfamiliar and awkward on her tongue. "Pleasure meeting you," she managed, though the words felt hollow, barely more than air. Her gaze flicked to Christopher. The man she had thought infallible, steady as stone, now seemed infinitely more complicated, his edges fraying in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had told herself she didn't care deeply about her children bearing the only claim to his legacy, her pride would not cling to such notions, she had thought, but now she felt the weight of what this meant. A child of his blood already here, close enough to cast a shadow over her future. And the embarrassment. Gods, the embarrassment. Bastard or not, it would haunt her courtly life, the whispers, the knowing looks. Whether the boy had been born before or after their union might matter little to the gossip-mongers who would lap at this like wolves over fresh kill. Her mother's warnings rushed back unbidden, sharp-edged as the day they were spoken. She had dismissed them at the time, prideful and resolute, but now they circled her mind like vultures. The sound of the world seemed to retreat, her thoughts roaring louder in its absence. She hardly noticed the moment the child's curious gaze faltered, or when Christopher shifted uncomfortably. "Sarah. Sarah." His voice snapped through her haze like a whip-crack, and she blinked, startled, as her eyes refocused on him. Christopher's expression had softened slightly, though there was still a flicker of unease there. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone low, measured. She nodded quickly, though her heart hadn't yet stilled. "Yes," she said, though it sounded too quick, too brittle. "Yes, of course. Forgive me, I was just surprised, that's all." Christopher held her gaze, his green-blue eyes searching hers for a heartbeat before turning his attention to the boy in his arms. "Tristan," he said gently, his tone warm but firm, "why don't you go with Mern to the mess hall? You must be getting hungry." Tristan blinked up at him, his small brow furrowing briefly, but he seemed to understand the unspoken tension in the room. Without a word of protest, he slid from his father's arms and took the guard's outstretched hand. His footsteps were soft against the stone as the pair exited the chamber, the door creaking shut behind them. The silence that followed was thick, weighted with all that had been left unsaid. Christopher turned back to her, his posture stiff as though bracing for something. He gestured toward the far corner of the room, away from the lingering presence of the guards. She followed, her thoughts churning with every step. The remaining guard withdrew as well, but her chaperone, Lady Maelle, remained firmly planted near the door. Her sharp eyes flitted across the room with the vigilance of a hawk, her lips pressed into a thin line. Christopher exhaled softly, his shoulders rising and falling as if burdened. "Sarah, I am terribly sorry that you had to learn of this in such a way," he said, his voice steady but laced with genuine regret. The carefully crafted mask he usually wore was gone, replaced by something unguarded, almost vulnerable. She didn't respond at once. Her thoughts churned in a chaotic storm, her mind tugged in two directions. Christopher had been her stone, her anchor when her life had felt adrift in the darkest waters. His letters, full of strength and understanding, had been her solace when she had felt so utterly alone. In her mind, she had built him into an image of perfection, a protector with a strong frame who would defend her from every threat, a man whose kindness and charm were meant for her alone. And then he had greeted her in the courtyard, and for a moment, it had seemed as though that dream had stepped from her imagination into the world. Every touch, every smile had reinforced the fantasy. She had been floating on clouds, her worries silenced, her heart light. Until now. Now, the boy's presence weighed on her like a stone, dragging her from that dream back to the unrelenting reality of the earth. The image of Christopher she had crafted, her protector, her strength, remained, but cracks had formed, fine lines of doubt splintering across the perfect surface. She couldn't ignore the gnawing thoughts the boy had stirred within her. Ugly thoughts. Unfair, even, but persistent all the same. She had told herself there was little Christopher could do or say that she wouldn't forgive. And yet, this. A bastard so close, so intertwined with their future? It was a truth she hadn't prepared herself for, and she hated the way it made her feel, small, jealous, uncertain. "Sarah?" Christopher's voice broke through the tempest of her thoughts. His green-blue eyes searched hers, his expression raw. "I hope you can forgive me." She blinked, realizing how long she had remained silent, caught in her maelstrom of doubt and resentment. Her lips parted, but the words didn't come. How could they, when she wasn't yet sure what she wanted to say? If there was one thing she knew, it was that she could not lose Christopher, nor the future they had begun to shape together. Whatever else she felt, that truth burned brighter than her doubts. Perhaps the boy could be ignored, folded neatly into the edges of their lives where he wouldn't trouble her. Was his mother dead? Or perhaps there could be an arrangement, something discreet and fitting. Her despair eased slightly as she clung to the thought. It was not a hopeless situation. Surely, once she and Christopher had their true children, the rightful heirs of the Mudd line, everything would settle into place. The boy was simply a relic of Christopher's worry for his legacy, nothing more. When she gave him sons and daughters, they would take precedence, how could they not? Her resolve grew, and her gaze softened. Of course, she faltered, then corrected herself, a touch of warmth slipping into her tone, Christopher. He watched her closely, his striking green-blue eyes searching hers, his expression filled with something cautious, almost fragile. Hope, reluctant and uncertain, flickered across his face. I promise to you now, he began, his voice firm yet burdened. It will never happen again. It was. She reached out, placing a finger gently against his lips. Let us look to the future, she said softly, cutting him off. Let the past be the past.